On November 17th, 2018, John Allen Chau paddled a kayak toward North Sentinel Island. He was 26 years old, American, a missionary. He wanted to make contact with the Sentinelese people. They killed him with arrows. His body was never recovered. The Indian government didn't even try. They know better than to approach that beach. The Sentinelese have lived on their small island for somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 years. Maybe longer. Nobody knows for sure. What we do know is this. They've been completely isolated from the rest of humanity for all that time. No contact, no trade, no shared diseases or ideas or genes. Nothing. They're not a lost tribe that wandered off a few centuries ago. They're not descendants of shipwreck survivors. They've been there since before the pyramids, since before agriculture, since before we domesticated dogs or invented the wheel, or figured out how to make bread. Think about what that means. While the rest of humanity was building Rome and inventing writing and splitting the atom, they stayed on their island. While we went from stone tools to smartphones in the blink of an evolutionary eye, they kept doing whatever they have always done. Fishing, hunting, living. We know almost nothing about them. What we do know comes from brief, violent encounters and observations from helicopters flying overhead. They live in small groups, maybe 50 to 150 people total on the whole island. They use bows and arrows. They fish. They gather food from the forest. They build shelters. That's about it. That's the sum total of human knowledge about the Sentinelese. Here's what we don't know. Their language, their beliefs, their stories, whether they have art or music or religion, how they organize themselves, what they think about the world, whether they even know other humans exist beyond their shore. We don't know if they remember a time before the island, if they have origin stories about coming from somewhere else, if they wonder about the helicopters and ships that sometimes appear, if they tell their children about the strange people who occasionally wash up on their beaches. The Indian government protects them now. It's illegal to go within 3 miles of North Sentinel Island. After the 2004 tsunami, a helicopter flew over to check if they survived. A man on the beach fired arrows at it. They survived. They wanted to be left alone. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. They're us, genetically identical, same brain size, same capacity for language and abstract thought and everything that makes us human. If you took a Sentinelese baby and raised them in New York, they'd grow up completely normal, learn English, use computers, go to college, whatever. But they've been isolated so long that they've become something we can barely understand. Not biologically different, culturally different. So different that contact is fatal. Not just because of disease, though, that's part of it. Because the gap is too wide to cross. 60,000 years of separate human experience. 60,000 years of different choices and adaptations and solutions to the problem of being alive. All compressed onto one small island that you can walk across in a few hours. What have they become in all that time? What do they know that we've forgotten? What have we learned that would mean nothing to them? And the deepest question, are they still us? Or have they drifted so far into their own version of humanity that the word us doesn't apply anymore? The thing about North Sentinel Island is that we can actually see it. It's right there. Google Earth will show you the beaches, the forest, the clearings where they live. But we can't know it. Not really. That gap between seeing and knowing tells us something important about human isolation, about what happens when groups of people split apart and stay apart, about how quickly we become strangers to each other. The Sentinelese aren't the only isolated people on Earth. They're just the most isolated, the most determined to stay that way. But there are others, small groups tucked into remote corners of the world, uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, communities in Papua New Guinea who only met outsiders in the 1930s, Groups who've been cut off for hundreds or thousands of years. Each one represents a different experiment in what humans can become. Let's start with what we know for certain. Humans have been spreading out and splitting apart for a very long time. Maybe 2 million years if you count earlier human species, definitely 300,000 years for modern humans like us. And here's what happens when populations separate. They drift. Not just genetically, though that happens too. They drift culturally, linguistically. They develop different solutions to the same problems, different tools, different stories, different ways of organizing their lives. This isn't speculation. We've watched it happen in real time. The Polynesians spread across the Pacific, starting around 3,000 years ago. They all came from the same source population, same language family, same basic culture, same boat-building technology. But then they landed on different islands, and those islands had different resources, different challenges, different neighbours or no neighbours at all. Within a few hundred years they'd become distinct. The Hawaiians developed one kind of society. The Maori in New Zealand developed another. The Rapa Nui on Easter Island developed a third. Same starting point, wildly different outcomes, and that's just 3,000 years. The Sentinelese have been isolated for 60,000. What does 60,000 years of isolation do to a culture? We have some clues from other long isolated populations. The Aboriginal Australians were cut off from the rest of humanity for at least 50,000 years, maybe longer. They developed hundreds of distinct language groups, thousands of different cultural practices, ways of life so adapted to their specific environments that they seem almost alien to outsiders. But here's the thing. When Europeans finally made contact in 1788, the Aboriginal Australians were still recognisably human, still us. Their languages were complex and sophisticated. Their art was beautiful. Their knowledge of their environment was encyclopedic. They had music and stories and social structures and everything that makes humans human. They'd just done it all differently, developed their own path, their own solutions. The same happened in the Americas. Humans crossed into North America maybe 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. Then the land bridge flooded. They were cut off from Asia, cut off from the populations they'd left behind. And in those 15,000 years they became something new, not biologically, culturally. They developed civilizations that looked nothing like anything in Europe or Asia. The Aztecs, the Inca, the Mississippian mound builders, the ancestral Puebloans. When Europeans arrived in 1492, they found people who'd invented writing independently, who'd built cities independently, who developed agriculture independently, who'd created art and architecture and mathematics and astronomy without any input from the old world. Different solutions, same human creativity. But 15,000 years is nothing compared to 60,000. And the Americas weren't really isolated. Humans there spread out, mixed, traded, fought, shared ideas across thousands of miles. They had a whole continent to work with. The Sentinelese have one small island, maybe 23 square miles. You could walk the whole thing in a day. What does that kind of isolation do? That kind of constraint? We know from other island populations that small size matters. A lot. Take Tasmania. It's an island south of Australia. Humans reached it maybe 40,000 years ago when sea levels were lower. Then the water rose. They were cut off, completely isolated for 10,000 years. When Europeans arrived in 1803, they found the Tasmanians had lost technologies, things their ancestors definitely had. They'd stopped making bone tools, stopped fishing with hooks, stopped wearing complex clothing. Their toolkit had simplified, gotten smaller. This isn't because they were less intelligent. It's because of population size. Small populations can't maintain complex technologies as easily. If the one person who knows how to make good fishing hooks dies before teaching someone else, that knowledge is gone, forever. With only a few hundred people, You can lose things, important things. The Sentinelese probably number between 50 and 150 people, maybe fewer now. That's incredibly small. Smaller than Tasmania, smaller than any population that's ever maintained complex technology for long periods. What have they lost in 60,000 years? What did they once know that's now forgotten? We know their ancestors had boats. They had to. You can't get to North Sentinel Island without boats. It's never been connected to the mainland. So at some point their ancestors were sophisticated enough to build ocean-going vessels, to navigate open water, to deliberately travel to a new place. Do they still have that technology? We don't know. We've never seen them use boats, just canoes for fishing close to shore. Simple ones. Maybe they lost the knowledge. Maybe they never needed it. Why build ocean-going boats when you're never leaving? Or maybe they remember. Maybe they have stories about the crossing, about the time before the island, and maybe they've decided, deliberately, never to leave, to stay, to keep the old ways alive by refusing the new ones. We can't know. And that's the point. The Sentinelese represent the furthest edge of human diversity. Not genetic diversity. We're all basically the same genetically. But cultural diversity. Experiential diversity. They've lived a completely different version of human history. Think about what they've never experienced. They've never met anyone who wasn't related to them, never encountered a new language, never seen metal, never tasted salt from anywhere but the sea, never heard music except what they make themselves. They've never had to negotiate with strangers, never had to learn new customs, never had to adapt to someone else's way of doing things. For 60,000 years their world has been exactly the same size, the same beaches, the same forest, the same fish in the same waters, generation after generation after generation. What does that do to a culture, to a way of thinking? In the rest of the world, humans have had to be flexible, adaptable. We've moved to new places with new challenges. We've met strangers and had to figure out how to coexist or compete. We've borrowed ideas and technologies from each other. We've mixed and changed and evolved culturally at a breakneck pace. The Sentinelese haven't had to do any of that. They've had one environment, one set of challenges, one group of people who all share the same history and assumptions and knowledge, maybe, that's made them more stable, more internally cohesive. Maybe their culture is ancient and unchanged because it works, because it's perfectly adapted to their specific circumstances. Or maybe it's made them fragile. Maybe they've lost the flexibility that comes from dealing with change. Maybe encountering outsiders is so traumatic precisely because they have no framework for it. No stories about strangers, no protocols for contact. We see this in their response to outsiders. It's always violent, always immediate. They don't try to communicate first. They don't approach with curiosity. They attack. That's not universal human behaviour. Most isolated groups, when first contacted, show curiosity. Caution, yes. Fear sometimes. But also interest. A desire to understand what these strange new people are. The Sentinelese just want us gone. Every single time. Maybe that's wisdom. Maybe they've learned, over millennia, that nothing good comes from the outside. That the ocean brings only danger. That strangers mean death. Or maybe it's cultural. Maybe they have stories about outsiders. Old stories. Stories about people who came from the sea long ago and brought disaster. Stories that have kept them isolated by choice. We know this happens. We know cultures develop origin stories that explain their isolation, that justify it, that make it sacred. The Polynesians who settled on remote islands often developed stories about why they shouldn't leave, why the island was special, why the outside world was dangerous or forbidden. These stories served a purpose. They kept people from attempting dangerous ocean voyages, They maintained social cohesion. Maybe the Sentinelese have similar stories. Maybe they're not isolated by accident. Maybe they're isolated by design, by choice, by ancient wisdom that says, stay here, stay together, stay alive. Or maybe they've simply forgotten that anywhere else exists. Maybe their world is so complete, so self-contained that the idea of elsewhere doesn't make sense. Maybe we're not enemies to them. Maybe we're just impossible, literally unthinkable. Here's what keeps me up at night about the Sentinelese. It's not just that we can't contact them, it's that we'll probably never be able to. The gap is too wide, the risk too high. Disease would kill them. Our presence would shatter whatever delicate balance they've maintained for 60,000 years. So they'll stay isolated, protected by law and by their own arrows, and we'll never know what they know, what they've learned, what they've become. They're like a parallel universe, a different branch of human possibility, a road not taken by the rest of us, and that road is closed now, forever. In 100 years they might be gone. Small populations are vulnerable. Disease, tsunami, genetic bottleneck. The Indian government does what it can to protect them, but you can't protect against everything. And when they're gone, we'll have lost something irreplaceable, not just a people, a version of humanity, a 60,000-year experiment in what humans can be when left completely alone. We'll never know what they figured out, what insights they developed, what their art looks like, what their music sounds like, what stories they tell about the stars. We'll never know if they're happy, if they wonder about us, if they dream of other places, if they even have a concept of other places. They're us, but they're also not us. They've become something we can see but can't understand. Something human but alien. The furthest distance you can travel while staying on Earth. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some mysteries should stay mysteries. Maybe some versions of humanity should remain unknown, unpolluted by contact, free to continue their own journey without interference. The Sentinelese chose isolation. Or their ancestors did, or circumstances did. Either way, they've maintained it, defended it, kept it sacred for longer than recorded history. That's worth respecting, even if it means we'll never satisfy our curiosity, even if it means some questions will never be answered. They're the last people on Earth who've never been conquered, never been converted, never been changed by contact with the outside world. That makes them precious, irreplaceable, and completely unknowable. The Sentinelese don't know we're doing this, don't know we're thinking about them, wondering about their lives, their choices, their 60,000 years of solitude. Maybe that's for the best. Let's get back to what happened when people tried to reach them. Because the history of contact attempts tells us something important about who they are, and who we are. The first recorded contact attempt happened in 1867. A merchant ship called the Nineveh ran aground on the reef. The crew made it to shore. They survived, but they saw the Sentinelese watching from the trees, waiting. The British sent a rescue party. By the time they arrived, the crew had built a raft and escaped. The Sentinelese never attacked. They just watched, waited for the strangers to leave. That pattern would repeat for the next 150 years. In 1880, a British colonial officer named Maurice Vidal Portman decided to make formal contact. He was the administrator for the Andaman Islands. He'd studied the other tribes in the region, the Ongje, the Jarawa, the Great Andamanese. He thought the Sentinelese would be similar. He was wrong. Portman landed with a large armed party. They searched the island for days. The Sentinelese vanished into the forest. Finally, Portman's men found an elderly couple and 4 children who couldn't run fast enough. They took them, brought them back to Port Blair, the colonial capital. Within days, the adults were dead, sick with diseases their bodies had never encountered. Portman panicked. He sent the children back to the island with gifts, pots, pans, cloth, red fabric because the other Andamanese tribes liked red. The children disappeared into the forest. The gifts were left on the beach. Nobody knows what happened next, whether the children survived, whether they told stories about the strange place they'd been taken, whether those stories made the Sentinelese more afraid, more determined to keep strangers away. For the next 90 years the island was mostly left alone. Ships gave it a wide berth. The reef made approach dangerous anyway. Occasionally someone would try to land. Sometimes they made it to shore. Sometimes they didn't. The Sentinelese response was always the same. Arrows, warnings, get away from our beach. Then in 1967, the Indian government decided to try again. They wanted to establish friendly relations with all the Andaman tribes, make them part of modern India, bring them development, education, healthcare. All the things that seemed obviously good to people who'd never asked whether the tribes wanted any of it. The director of tribal welfare was a man named T.N. Pandit. He led expeditions to North Sentinel Island for the next 24 years, more than 50 trips, each one following the same careful protocol. They'd approach in a boat, stay offshore, wait to be seen, then they'd wade into the shallows and leave gifts, coconuts mostly. The Sentinelese don't have coconut palms on their island. The soil's wrong, but coconuts wash up on the beach sometimes. The people know what they are, they like them. So Pandit's team would pile coconuts on the sand, then back away. Return to the boat. Wait. Sometimes the Sentinelese would come down to the beach, young men mostly, armed with bows. They'd shout, make threatening gestures, fire warning arrows into the sand. The expedition would stay in the boat, show empty hands, make friendly gestures. Eventually they'd leave. The next trip they'd do it again, leave coconuts, back away, wait. For years this was the whole relationship. Gifts left, warnings given, nobody crossing the line. Then in 1991 something changed. On January 4th, Pandit's team approached as usual, left coconuts, started to back away. But this time the sentinels came down to the beach, unarmed, no bows, no arrows, just people. They picked up the coconuts, looked at the expedition team. One man waded into the water, stood there. The two groups stared at each other across maybe 20 feet of shallow water. Pandit described it as the most significant moment in the history of contact attempts. For the first time in recorded history, the Sentinelese had approached outsiders without weapons, had accepted gifts without hostility, had shown something that might have been curiosity instead of just fear and anger. The expeditions continued. More gifts, more brief encounters. The Sentinelese would take coconuts, sometimes bananas. Sometimes they'd gesture for the boats to come closer, but they never let anyone actually land, never let anyone pass the water line. In 1996, the Indian government stopped the expeditions, not because of any incident, just a policy shift. Anthropologists were starting to question the whole idea of contact, starting to ask whether it was ethical to push relationships on people who clearly didn't want them, whether gifts of coconuts were worth the risk of introducing diseases, whether friendly intentions mattered if the other side kept saying no. The new policy was simple. Leave them alone, protect the island, keep everyone else away. Let the Sentinelese decide their own future, but people kept trying. In 2004, the tsunami hit. The same earthquake that killed 230,000 people across the Indian Ocean sent waves crashing over North Sentinel Island. The Indian Coast Guard flew helicopters over to check for survivors. They saw Sentinelese people on the beach, alive, apparently unharmed. One man fired arrows at the helicopter. They were fine. They didn't need help. They didn't want help. The message was clear. 2 fishermen found that out in 2006. They were fishing illegally near the island, too close to shore. Their boat drifted. Maybe they fell asleep. Maybe they were drunk. Their boat crossed into the shallows. The Sentinelese killed them both, buried the bodies on the beach. The Indian government sent a helicopter to recover the bodies. The Sentinelese fired arrows. The helicopter left. The bodies were never recovered. The government didn't try again. They knew the fishermen had violated the exclusion zone, had ignored the warnings, had paid the price. That's when the policy became absolute. A 3-mile exclusion zone around the entire island. No exceptions. The Indian Navy patrols it. Turns back any boats that get too close. The penalties are serious. Jail time. Heavy fines. Not for the Sentinelese. For anyone who tries to approach them. Which brings us back to Allen Chau. In 2018, he paid fishermen to take him to the island. They waited offshore while he paddled a kayak to the beach. He'd been planning this for years, studying maps, learning about the Sentinelese, training for the physical challenges. He saw it as a mission from God, a calling to bring Christianity to the last unreached people on earth. He made it to shore on his first attempt. The Sentinelese surrounded him. A boy fired an arrow that hit his Bible. Chau retreated to the boat, went back the next day. This time they killed him. The fishermen watched from offshore, saw the Sentinelese drag his body up the beach, saw them bury it in the sand. The Indian government investigated, arrested the fisherman who'd helped him. But they didn't try to recover the body, didn't send police or soldiers to the island, didn't demand justice or answers. They just reinforced the exclusion zone, made the penalties clearer, reminded the world that the Sentinelese have the right to be left alone. Here's what all these contact attempts tell us. The Sentinelese aren't mindlessly violent. They're not attacking everyone who comes near. They're defending their home, making choices about who to tolerate and who to drive away. When Portman's rescue party searched for the kidnapped children, they didn't attack. They hid. When the tsunami happened, they survived on their own. When helicopters flew over, they fired warning shots. When fishermen drifted too close, they killed them. When Chau kept coming back after being warned, they killed him too. There's a pattern there, a logic. They're not random. They're responding to threats, making decisions about risk, about boundaries, about what level of intrusion deserves what level of response. That takes intelligence, planning, social organization. They have to coordinate their response, decide as a group who approaches the beach, who carries weapons, who fires warning shots, who decides when warnings aren't enough. We can see this in the 1991 encounter, when they came to the beach unarmed. That wasn't one person's choice. That was a group decision. Someone had to convince the others it was safe. Someone had to argue for trying something different. Someone had to be willing to take the risk. And then later, someone had to convince them to stop, to go back to the old policy of keeping everyone away. Because after 1996, they never approached peacefully again. The brief window of possible friendship closed. They went back to arrows and warnings. What changed their minds? We'll never know. Maybe someone got sick from the contact. Maybe the elders decided it was too dangerous. Maybe they just didn't see the point. Coconuts wash up on the beach anyway. What do they need from us? The anthropologist who studied the contact attempts most carefully was Madhumala Chattopadhyay. She was on many of Pandit's expeditions. She's one of the few outsiders who stood on that beach, who's looked into Sentinelese faces from 20 feet away. She says they're not primitive, not simple. They're making sophisticated choices about their relationship with the outside world. They know we exist. They've seen our boats, our helicopters, our gifts. They've had chances to engage, to trade, to learn about what's out there. They've chosen not to. That's not ignorance. That's a decision. Think about what that means. They've maintained that decision across generations, parents teaching children, elders teaching young adults. The story gets passed down. The strangers come, they bring gifts, they seem friendly, but we don't trust them. We don't want what they're offering. We fire arrows, we make them leave. For that story to survive 150 years of contact attempts, it has to be deeply embedded in their culture. It has to be taught carefully, reinforced constantly, because every generation has to make the same choice. Every time a boat approaches, someone has to decide, do we try something different this time? Do we see what they want? And every time, for 150 years, the answer has been no. Keep them away, protect the island, protect our lives, protect whatever it is we've built here over 60,000 years. That consistency tells us something important. They're not isolated because they're stuck. They're isolated because they choose to be. Because whatever they have is worth protecting. Because whatever we're offering isn't worth the risk of losing what they already possess. So what do we actually know about the Sentinelese? What can we learn from 150 years of failed contact attempts and distant observation? Not much, but what we do know is fascinating. Start with the basics. Population estimates range from 50 to 400 people. That's a huge range. We can't get closer than that. Aerial surveys show groups of people, maybe 15 here, maybe 20 there. But we can't count everyone, can't see into the forest, can't know how many settlements exist inland. Most estimates settle around 100 to 150 people. That's based on the size of the island, the resources available, how many people a hunter-gatherer society can support in that environment. But it's just a guess. Could be twice that, could be half. What we can see from the air tells us they live in small groups, multiple settlements scattered across the island, not one big village. That makes sense for hunter-gatherers. You spread out, use different parts of the territory. Don't exhaust the resources in one spot. They build shelters, simple structures, lean-tos made from palm fronds and branches. Some look temporary, others more permanent. The structures appear in different locations over time. They move around, following food sources probably. Fish in one season, fruit in another, shellfish when the tide's right. Their technology looks basic from the outside. Bows and arrows, spears, boats carved from single logs, no metal, no pottery that we've seen, no woven cloth. They wear minimal clothing, sometimes none at all, sometimes fibre skirts or belts, sometimes decorations made from shells or plants. But basic doesn't mean simple. Those bows kill people. Those arrows fly straight and true. Someone taught them how to make those weapons, how to shape the wood, how to attach the points, how to judge distance and wind. That knowledge gets passed down, refined over generations. Same with the boats. Carving a functional canoe from a log takes skill. You need to know which trees work best, how to hollow them out without cracking the wood, how to balance them so they don't flip in the surf. The Sentinelese navigate those boats through reef breaks that would terrify experienced sailors. They know their waters, know the currents, know where the rocks hide beneath the surface. So yes, their technology looks primitive compared to ours, but it works perfectly for their environment. They've survived 60,000 years with these tools. How many of our technologies will last that long? Here's what else we know. They fish. We've seen them wading in the shallows with spears, standing perfectly still, waiting for fish to swim close, then striking fast. They're good at it. Patient, skilled. They gather shellfish. The beaches show evidence of this. Piles of shells near their camps, oysters, clams, whatever the reef provides. Protein from the sea, easy to collect at low tide. They hunt. Wild pigs live on the island. The Sentinelese hunt them with bows. We've seen pig bones at their campsites, seen them carrying meat. They know how to track, how to get close enough for a clean shot, how to process the kill. They gather plants, fruits, roots. whatever the forest offers. The island has limited resources compared to mainland forests, but they've learned every edible plant, every useful material, every source of food and fibre and medicine their environment provides. Their diet is probably similar to other Andamanese tribes, fish and shellfish making up maybe 60%, hunted meat another 20%, gathered plants the rest, high protein, low carbohydrates, no agriculture, no domesticated animals, just what nature provides. And nature provides enough. They're not starving, not desperate. The people we've seen from helicopters look healthy, strong, well-fed. Their population stays stable. That means they're living within their means, not exceeding what the island can support. They control fire. We've seen smoke from their camps, seen them carrying torches at night. Fire means cooked food, warmth, light, protection from animals. The ability to make fire is fundamental. You can't survive in a tropical forest without it. Too many parasites in raw food, too many dangers in the dark. But how do they make fire? Do they use friction, strike sparks from stones, keep fires burning continuously so they never have to restart them? We don't know. Can't see the details from helicopters or boats. They have language. Obviously, you can't coordinate group defense without communication. Can't teach children without words. Can't pass down knowledge about plants and animals and weather and seasons without a rich vocabulary. What does their language sound like? What family does it belong to? Is it related to other Andamanese languages? Or has it diverged so much over 60,000 years that it's completely unique? Nobody knows. Nobody's heard enough to analyse it. The few recorded encounters captured shouting, warnings, threats, not normal conversation. Linguistic isolation is profound. Languages change fast. 1,000 years of separation creates mutual unintelligibility. 5,000 years and the connection becomes almost impossible to trace. 60,000 years. Their language could be as different from ours as any human language can be from another. Or it might share deep structural features that all human languages possess. We can't know without hearing it properly, without recording it, analysing it, comparing it to other languages. They have social structure. Group decisions require hierarchy. Someone leads. Someone decides when to approach strangers, when to attack, when to retreat. Maybe it's elders. Maybe it's the strongest warriors. Maybe it's consensus among adults. But there's organisation there. You can see it in how they respond to threats. Coordinated, disciplined, not random. They have culture, beliefs, stories, explanations for why the world works the way it does. Every human society has these things. The Sentinelese must too. What do they believe about the sun, the moon, the ocean, death, dreams? Do they have gods, spirits, ancestors who watch over them? Do they tell stories about the beginning of the world, about how their people came to be? We'll probably never know. Those stories exist only in their language, only in their minds. When the last Sentinelese person dies, those stories die too. Thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, gone. No written record, no audio recording, nothing. They have art, probably. Most human societies do. Body decoration at minimum, patterns painted on skin, ornaments worn for beauty or status or ritual. Maybe they carve designs into wood. Maybe they arrange shells in patterns. Maybe they dance, sing, tell stories with gestures and voices. Art is human. It shows up everywhere humans exist. The Sentinelese are human. So they probably have art, but we've never seen it, never heard their songs, never watched their dances. They have childhood. Children need years to learn everything required for survival, how to fish, hunt, gather, make weapons, navigate boats, read weather, understand seasons, recognize dangerous plants, treat injuries. All of this takes teaching, practice, patience. Sentinelese children must play, learn, make mistakes, get corrected, try again. Just like children everywhere, they have adolescence, young people testing boundaries, learning adult skills, competing for status, forming relationships, becoming full members of the group. This is universal, biological. The Sentinelese must go through it too. They have old age. If you survive childhood diseases and accidents and childbirth, you can live long. Hunter-gatherers who make it to adulthood often reach 60 or 70. The Sentinelese probably have elders, people who've lived long enough to remember rare events, unusual weather, times of plenty, times of scarcity. Those people hold valuable knowledge, get respected, get listened to when important decisions need making. They have death, bodies to dispose of, grief to process, explanations to give children. Every society handles death differently. Burial, cremation, exposure, ritual, ceremony, silence. What do the Sentinelese do? We've seen them bury the bodies of people they killed. Does that mean they bury their own dead too? Or was that just disposing of a threat? Making sure the strangers stayed gone? Here's what we don't know. Almost everything else. We don't know their names. Not for individuals, not for their group, not for their island. Sentinelese is our word, not theirs. What do they call themselves? What do they call their home? We don't know their history, their origin stories, their memories of ancestors. Do they remember a time before the island? Do they have stories about coming from somewhere else? Or have they been there so long that their myths place creation right there on that beach? We don't know their cosmology, their understanding of the universe. Why does the sun rise? Where do storms come from? What happens after death? Every culture has answers. The Sentinelese must too. We don't know their social relationships. Who's related to who? How do they choose partners? Do they have marriage, monogamy, polygamy, arranged partnerships, free choice? Do they have incest taboos, exogamy rules, ways of preventing inbreeding in a small population? That last one matters. 100 people is a small gene pool, too small for long-term survival without some strategy. Either they're larger than we think, or they have cultural rules about who can partner with who, or they've been lucky, or they've had occasional contact we don't know about, genes flowing in from somewhere, somehow. We don't know their health. What diseases do they carry? What parasites? What genetic conditions? Are they healthy by modern standards, or do they suffer from things we could easily prevent? Tooth decay, infections, parasites, malnutrition. We can't know without examining them, and we'll never do that. We don't know their lifespan. How long do they typically live? What's the infant mortality rate? How many children does each woman have? How many survive to adulthood? These numbers determine whether the population grows or shrinks, whether they're thriving or barely hanging on. We don't know their emotional lives. Do they laugh, cry, feel joy, sorrow, anger, fear? Of course they do. They're human. But what makes them laugh? What makes them sad? What brings them together in celebration? What tears them apart in conflict? We don't know their dreams, what they hope for, what they fear, what they consider a good life, success, failure, beauty, ugliness, right, wrong. All of this exists in their minds, shapes their choices, drives their behavior, and will never access it. The distance between what we can see and what we can know is vast. We can watch from helicopters, count rough numbers, observe basic activities, fishing, building, moving along the beach. But we can't understand, can't interpret, can't know what any of it means to them. Anthropologists call this the observer's paradox. The closer you get, the more you change what you're observing. The Sentinelese in the presence of strangers aren't the Sentinelese alone. They're defensive, threatened, performing their role as guardians of the island. We never see them relaxed, never see them as they are when nobody's watching, and we never will. The decision has been made. Leave them alone, protect their isolation, accept that some things can't be known, some people can't be studied, some mysteries stay mysteries. That's hard for us. We want to know, want to understand, want to categorize and explain and fit everything into our frameworks. But the Sentinelese don't fit. They're outside our frameworks, beyond our reach. Living proof that human knowledge has limits. Maybe that's okay. Maybe some things should stay unknown. Maybe the Sentinelese teach us something important by staying hidden. That not everything needs to be discovered. Not everyone needs to be contacted. Not all mysteries need solutions. They've chosen isolation, chosen to remain unknown. That choice deserves respect, even if it means we'll never know what 60,000 years of separation has created. Never know what they've become. Never know what we might learn from them. The not knowing is the price of their freedom. And maybe that's a price worth paying. The Sentinelers aren't alone in their isolation. They're just the most extreme example. Other Andamanese tribes exist, or existed, past tense for most of them. The Great Andamanese once numbered around 10,000 people, spread across multiple islands, multiple distinct groups with their own languages and territories. British. Colonization arrived in 1858. Within 50 years, the population dropped to around 600. Disease mostly. Measles, influenza, syphilis, things their immune systems had never encountered. Today there are 44 Great Andamanese people left. They live on a small island provided by the Indian government. They speak Hindi mostly. Their original languages are nearly extinct. A few elders remember fragments, words for fish, for weather, for things that don't exist anymore. The Ong live on Little Andaman Island. They numbered around 670 when contact began in the 1800s. Now there are about 100. They've had steady contact with outsiders for over a century. They speak their own language still, maintain some traditional practices, but they also wear modern clothes, use metal tools, live in government settlements. The Jarawa stayed isolated until the 1990s. Around 400 people. They lived in the forest, avoided outsiders, shot arrows at anyone who came close. Sound familiar? But a highway cut through their territory in the 1970s. Settlers moved in, poachers entered their forest, contact became inevitable. The Jarawa started coming out in 1996, cautious at first, then more regularly. They accepted gifts, food, clothes, tools. Some groups still avoid outsiders, others interact frequently. The transition happened fast. One generation isolated, the next generation riding motorcycles and eating rice. What happened to these other tribes shows us what might happen to the Sentinelese, what contact means, what it costs. Start with disease. This is the big one, the immediate threat. Isolated populations have no immunity to common illnesses. None. Their immune systems never encountered these pathogens, never developed defences, never built up resistance through generations of exposure. When the Great Andamanese first met British colonisers, influenza killed them in waves. Not because influenza is particularly deadly, it's not. Most people recover, but the Great Andamanese had no antibodies, no genetic resistance, no cultural knowledge about treatment. A mild flu became a death sentence. Measles hit even harder. Measles spreads fast, infects nearly everyone in a virgin population, kills 20 to 30% in groups with no prior exposure. Children especially, the very old, anyone already weakened by other conditions. Syphilis came from sexual contact with colonizers, spread through the population, caused sterility, birth defects, madness, slow, painful death. Within 2 generations, birth rates collapsed, more people dying than being born. The pattern repeated everywhere isolated groups met outsiders. North America, Australia, the Pacific Islands, the Amazon. Doesn't matter where. Doesn't matter when. Disease always comes first, always kills the most people, always does more damage than any other aspect of contact. The Sentinelese face the same risk, maybe worse. They're more isolated than any group that's ever made contact. Their immune systems have been developing independently for 60,000 years. They've never been exposed to anything from the outside world. Not flu, not measles, not tuberculosis, not the common cold. A single sick visitor could kill them all. Not an exaggeration, not hyperbole. Actual epidemiologists say this. One person carrying a mild respiratory infection could trigger an epidemic that wipes out the entire population within weeks. That's why the Indian government prohibits contact, why they enforce a 3-mile exclusion zone around the island, why they didn't recover John Chau's body. The risk isn't worth it. Not to the Sentinelese, not to anyone. But disease is just the beginning. Contact brings other changes, deeper ones, harder to see but just as destructive. Look at what happened to Jarawa culture. They maintained their independence for thousands of years, lived in the forest, hunted, gathered, raised children who learned the old ways. Then the highway came, tourists came, settlers came, everything shifted. The Jarawa started wanting things they'd never wanted before. Metal knives, matches, cloth, rice, sugar. These things made life easier in some ways. A metal knife cuts better than a stone one. Matches start fires faster than friction. But each new tool created dependence, created need where none existed before. Young Jarawa stopped learning traditional skills. Why learn to make fire by friction when matches are easier? Why learn to knap stone tools when metal knives are sharper? Why learn which plants are edible when you can just ask for rice? Within 1 generation, crucial knowledge started disappearing. The elders still knew, still remembered. But the young people weren't learning, weren't interested. The old ways seemed hard, primitive, unnecessary. Language shifted too. Jarawa children started learning Hindi. Easier to communicate with outsiders that way. Easier to get what they wanted. But every word of Hindi replaced a word of Jarawa. Every conversation in Hindi was a conversation not happening in their ancestral language. Languages carry culture. Embedded in the words are concepts, categories, ways of understanding the world. When a language dies, that understanding dies too. You can't translate it perfectly, can't capture it in another tongue. It's just gone. The Jarawa language has words for things that don't exist in Hindi. Specific types of honey, particular bird calls, subtle changes in weather. These words describe their world, their knowledge, their relationship with the forest. As Hindi replaces Jarawa, that knowledge becomes harder to express, harder to remember, easier to forget. Social structure changed too. Traditional Jarawa society had its own hierarchy, its own rules about leadership and decision-making and conflict resolution. But contact introduced new power dynamics. People who spoke Hindi had advantages. People who understood money had power. People who could negotiate with outsiders became important in new ways. Old forms of status became less relevant. Being the best hunter mattered less when you could just buy meat. Knowing the forest mattered less when you could just follow the highway. Traditional leaders lost authority. New leaders emerged. People who understood the outside world, who could navigate both cultures. This created tension. Conflict between generations, between those who wanted to maintain tradition and those who wanted to embrace change, between those who saw outsiders as threats and those who saw them as opportunities. Families split, communities fractured. The cohesion that sustained them for thousands of years started breaking down. Not because anyone wanted it to, but because contact creates pressure, forces choices, demands adaptation. The Ong went through something similar. They accepted contact earlier, more completely. Now they live in government settlements, receive rations, send children to school, wear modern clothes, use modern medicine. In some ways, their lives improved. Infant mortality dropped. Lifespan increased. Access to emergency medical care saved lives that would have been lost to injury or infection. But they also lost things. Lost autonomy. Lost self-sufficiency. Lost the knowledge systems that sustained them for millennia. Lost the connection to land and sea and forest that defined their identity. Many Ongs struggle with this, feel caught between worlds, not traditional anymore, not modern either. Something in between, something new, something that doesn't quite fit anywhere. Depression rates are high, alcoholism is a problem, suicide happens. These weren't issues in traditional society. They're issues now, products of cultural disruption, of losing your place in the world, of not knowing who you're supposed to be anymore. The Great Andamanese have it worse. Their population is so small that genetic diversity is a concern. Inbreeding is inevitable. Health problems accumulate. Each generation slightly weaker than the last. They've lost almost everything. Language, culture, traditional knowledge, territory, independence. They survive on government support, live where they're told to live, eat what they're given. Their children learn Hindi in school, learn Indian history, learn to be Indian citizens. Not Great Andamanese. In 2 or 3 more generations, there might not be any Great Andamanese left. Not really. There will be people with Great Andamanese ancestry, but the culture will be gone. The language will be dead. The knowledge will be forgotten. There'll be Indian citizens who happen to have indigenous heritage. Nothing more. This is what contact does. This is the pattern. This is what happens when isolated groups meet the modern world. First comes disease, people die, populations crash. Then comes dependence, new tools, new foods, new needs. Traditional skills become obsolete. Self-sufficiency erodes. Then comes cultural loss. Language shifts. Knowledge disappears. Social structures break down. Identity becomes confused. Then comes assimilation. The next generation speaks the dominant language, wears modern clothes, follows modern customs, becomes part of the larger society. Then comes extinction. Not necessarily biological extinction, but cultural extinction. The group ceases to exist as a distinct people. They become a footnote, a historical curiosity, a sad story about what used to be. This happened to hundreds of indigenous groups, thousands maybe, around the world, throughout history. The pattern is consistent, predictable, almost inevitable once contact begins. The Sentinelese are the last group that hasn't started down this path, the last people who remain completely outside the modern world, completely independent, completely themselves. That's why their isolation matters, not just to them, to all of us. They represent something we've almost completely lost, the possibility of human societies existing on their own terms, making their own choices, following their own path, uninfluenced by the homogenizing force of global culture. Every other isolated group has been contacted, changed, absorbed. The Sentinelese are the exception, the holdouts, the last ones who said no and made it stick. But their neighbours show us how fragile that independence is, how quickly it can collapse once contact begins, how irreversible the changes are. The Jarawa went from total isolation to riding motorcycles in 1 generation. 1. That's how fast it happens. That's how little time it takes for everything to change. The Great Andamanese went from 10,000 people to 44 in 150 years. That's how deadly contact can be. That's how steep the cost. The Ongo went from self-sufficient hunter-gatherers to government dependence in a century. That's how completely traditional life can disappear. These aren't ancient histories. This is happening now. The last Jarawa elder who remembers life before contact is probably still alive. The last great Andamanese speaker of the original languages might still exist. The cultural destruction is ongoing, active, visible, and it shows us what the Sentinelese are avoiding, what they're protecting themselves from, what they understand even if they can't articulate it in ways we'd recognize. They've seen what happened to their neighbors, maybe not directly, maybe not in detail, but they know. Somehow they know. The arrows aren't just about fear, they're about preservation, about refusing a path that leads to destruction. The other Andamanese tribes are warnings, living examples of what contact costs, what it takes, what it leaves behind. The Sentinelese have chosen differently, chosen isolation, chosen independence, chosen to remain unknown rather than risk becoming like their neighbours. And maybe they're right. Maybe the price of contact really is too high. Maybe what they'd lose is more valuable than what they'd gain. The modern world offers medicine, technology, comfort, longer lives, less hunger, less disease, but it demands everything in return. Language, culture, independence, identity, the right to be different, the right to choose your own path, the right to say no. The other Andamanese accepted that trade, some willingly, some not. All of them changed. All of them lost things they can never get back. The Sentinelers haven't made that trade yet. Maybe they never will. Their neighbours show us why. But there's another threat beyond disease and cultural destruction. Something invisible. Something written into their bodies. The Sentinelers face a genetic problem. A silent crisis coded into their DNA. Small populations create genetic bottlenecks. This is basic biology. When a group stays isolated and small for thousands of years, genetic diversity shrinks. The gene pool gets shallow. Problems accumulate. Think about how genetics works. You inherit half your DNA from your mother, half from your father. They inherited from their parents. And so on back through time. The more people in the breeding population, the more genetic variation exists, more combinations, more possibilities, more resilience. But when the population stays small, you start seeing the same genes over and over. Cousins marry cousins. Distant relatives have children together. Not by choice necessarily, just because there aren't many options. Everyone's related somehow. This creates problems over time. Harmful recessive genes get expressed more often, genetic disorders become common, immune systems become less diverse, fertility drops, birth defects increase. The Sentinelese population might be 100 people, maybe 150. That's the current estimate. But it's probably been around that size for thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands of years. A small group on a small island, breeding within the same limited gene pool generation after generation. Geneticists worry about this. They use terms like inbreeding depression and genetic drift. The language is technical, but the concept is simple. Small isolated populations lose genetic diversity, and that loss makes them vulnerable. Look at other isolated populations. The Ong have genetic diversity problems. Studies show reduced variation in their mitochondrial DNA, higher rates of certain genetic disorders, lower fertility than you'd expect in a healthy population. The Great Andamanese have it worse. Only 44 people left. Genetic testing shows they're all closely related. The gene pool is tiny, dangerously shallow. Inbreeding is inevitable at this point. Each generation slightly weaker, slightly more vulnerable to genetic problems. Island populations everywhere show this pattern. Tasmania, Easter Island, remote Pacific atolls. Anywhere humans lived in small isolated groups for long periods. The genetic evidence tells the same story. Diversity drops, problems accumulate, populations become fragile. The Sentinelese have been isolated longer than almost any other group. 60,000 years, maybe more. That's 2,000 generations of breeding within the same small population. 2,000 generations of the gene pool getting shallower and shallower. But here's what's strange. They're still here, still surviving, still healthy enough to defend their island with vigour, still having children who grow into adults who have more children. That suggests something important. Either their population was larger in the past, or they've somehow maintained enough genetic diversity to avoid the worst problems. Or they've adapted in ways we don't understand. Some geneticists think ancient populations might have been larger. Maybe North Sentinel Island supported 500 people at some point, maybe 1,000. More genetic diversity, more variation in the gene pool. That diversity could sustain them even as the population shrank later. Others think there might have been occasional contact with other Andamanese groups, long ago. Before the islands became as isolated as they are now, a few individuals crossing between islands, enough to introduce new genes, enough to prevent total genetic stagnation. We can't know for sure, can't test their DNA without contact, can't study their genetics without putting them at risk, so we're left guessing based on what we know about other populations. What we do know is that genetic diversity matters for survival, especially for immune system genes. These genes help your body recognize and fight diseases. The more variation you have, the better your immune system can handle new threats. Isolated populations tend to have less variation in immune system genes. Their bodies are good at fighting local diseases, things they've encountered for generations. But new diseases hit harder, spread faster, kill more people. This is why European diseases devastated Native Americans, why Pacific Islanders died in huge numbers from introduced illnesses, why the Great Andamanese population crashed so quickly. Limited genetic diversity in immune system genes, bodies, that couldn't adapt fast enough. The Sentinelese probably have the same vulnerability. Their immune systems are tuned to local pathogens, local parasites, local bacteria and viruses, but they've never encountered flu, never fought measles, never developed resistance to tuberculosis. Even a mild cold could be devastating. The genetic diversity that protects most human populations doesn't exist for them. One person's immune system might handle an infection, but if everyone has similar immune genes, everyone gets sick, everyone suffers, many die. This makes them incredibly fragile. More fragile than their arrows and their fierceness suggest. They look strong, they act strong, but genetically, they're vulnerable in ways they can't possibly understand. There's another genetic concern: fertility. Small populations often develop fertility problems over time. Lower sperm counts, higher rates of miscarriage, more difficulty conceiving. This happens when harmful recessive genes accumulate. We don't know if the Sentinelese face this problem. Their population seems stable, but stable doesn't mean healthy. A population can maintain its size while still struggling with fertility issues. High birth rates offset by high infant mortality. Many pregnancies but fewer successful births. Traditional societies often have natural mechanisms that help. Marriage rules that prevent close relatives from having children. Social structures that encourage genetic mixing within the group. Taboos against certain unions. The Sentinelese probably have similar rules. Most human societies do. But on an island with maybe 100 people, everyone is already related. The rules can only do so much. Eventually you're choosing between third cousins and fourth cousins. Still family, still limited diversity. Genetic problems don't appear overnight. They build slowly, generation by generation. A slightly higher rate of birth defects here, a slightly lower fertility rate there, immune systems that work a little less well, bodies that are a little less resilient. Over thousands of years, these small effects add up. The population becomes more fragile, more vulnerable, less able to handle stress or sudden changes, and yet the Sentinelese survive. They've survived for 60,000 years, through climate changes, through rising and falling sea levels, through whatever challenges their isolation has thrown at them. That survival suggests they've found ways to cope with genetic limitations. Maybe their population was larger in the past. Maybe they have cultural practices that help maintain health despite limited diversity. Maybe they've just been lucky. Or maybe they're tougher than we think, more resilient, more adapted to their specific environment. But luck runs out. Resilience has limits, and genetic vulnerabilities don't go away. They just wait. This is what makes contact so dangerous. The Sentinelese might survive on their own for another 60,000 years. But introduce one new disease and the genetic fragility becomes fatal. Their limited immune diversity becomes a death sentence. Other Andamanese tribes showed us this pattern. The Jarawa had larger populations than the Sentinelese, more genetic diversity, better immune systems, but contact still devastated them. Disease still killed huge numbers. The Great Andamanese had even more people, thousands, spread across multiple islands, more genetic mixing, more diversity, and they still crashed to 44 people within a few generations of contact. If groups with more genetic diversity couldn't survive contact, what chance do the Sentinelese have, with their smaller population, their deeper isolation, their more limited gene pool? The math is brutal. Take a population of 100 people, introduce a disease with a 30% mortality rate, you lose 30 people, now you have 70. The gene pool just got smaller, genetic diversity just dropped. The next disease hits a weaker population, kills more, the spiral continues. This is why some scientists argue for complete non-contact. Not just limited contact, not just careful contact, zero contact, forever. Because any contact risks triggering a genetic collapse that the Sentinelese can't recover from. Their isolation is their protection, but it's also their vulnerability. The same factors that kept them independent for 60,000 years also made them genetically fragile. The same small population that maintained their culture also limited their genetic resilience. They're caught in a trap. Isolation protects them from disease but makes them vulnerable to genetic problems. Contact might introduce genetic diversity, but would definitely introduce disease. There's no good option, no safe path forward, so they stay isolated, stay small, stay vulnerable. Because the alternative is worse. Because contact has destroyed every other isolated group that tried it. Because genetic vulnerability plus new diseases equals extinction. The Sentinelese don't know about genetics, don't understand DNA or immune systems or genetic diversity, but they don't need to. They've seen what happened to their neighbours, seen the deaths, seen the population crashes, seen entire cultures disappear. Their arrows keep more than strangers away. They keep genetic catastrophe at bay. They maintain the fragile balance that sustained them for millennia. But that balance is precarious. One shipwreck with survivors who stay too long. One determined missionary who makes it to shore. One government program that decides contact is necessary. Any of these could trigger the genetic collapse that ends 60,000 years of survival. The other Andamanese tribes are warnings. The Great Andamanese show what happens when genetic diversity is already limited and contact introduces disease. The Jarawa show how fast populations can crash. The Yong show how genetic problems persist even after populations stabilize. All of them had advantages the Sentinelese lack: larger populations, more genetic diversity, more resilience, and all of them still suffered devastating losses. The Sentinelese are the last ones who haven't faced this test, the last group whose genetic vulnerability hasn't been exposed by contact, the last population that might survive if left alone but would almost certainly collapse if disturbed. Their genes tell a story they don't know they're telling, a story of isolation and survival and fragility. A story written in DNA sequences and immune system variations and slowly accumulating genetic problems. We can't read that story directly, can't sequence their genomes, can't study their genetics, can't measure their diversity, but we can infer, can guess, can compare to other populations, and what we infer is sobering. They're probably more genetically vulnerable than any other surviving human population, more isolated, more fragile, more at risk. But they're also still here, still surviving, still strong enough to defend themselves, still having children, still maintaining their culture and their independence. That survival is remarkable, against the odds, against the genetic pressures that should have weakened them, against everything we know about small isolated populations. Maybe they're tougher than genetics predicts. Maybe isolation isn't as damaging as we think. Maybe 60,000 years taught them adaptations we don't understand. Or maybe they're just lucky, and their luck is running out. Let's get into what's really at stake for the people of North Sentinel Island. Not just the invisible dangers in their DNA, but the dangers floating in the air, hiding in droplets, riding on the skin and breath of anyone who comes close. This is the wall of disease. It's shaped their world in ways most of us can barely imagine. Picture it. For thousands of years, their island was a bubble. No new people, no new animals except the ones they hunted. Even the plants and insects were mostly local. The weather changed, the tides shifted, but the diseases, those didn't change much. Maybe some stomach bugs, skin infections, parasites from the water, the kind of illnesses people could adapt to over generations. Nothing like what came later. Now, think about how disease works in bigger societies. In cities and crowded villages, germs have plenty of hosts. A virus jumps from one person to another, mutating as it goes. Some people die, others survive and pass on their resistance to their children. Over time, the whole population gets tougher. Immunity builds up generation after generation. But what happens on a small island? No one brings in new diseases. No travellers, no traders, no ships stopping for supplies. It's just the same families, the same germs, year after year. If a virus needs fresh bodies to survive, it burns out fast. The people recover or die, and then nothing. The disease disappears. The survivors pass on whatever resistance they have, but it doesn't matter much because new diseases don't arrive. This sounds safe, until something new shows up. Then it's disaster. History is full of examples. When Europeans sailed to the Americas, they brought smallpox, measles, and influenza. These diseases tore through Native American communities. Entire villages vanished in a few weeks. Some estimates say 90% of the population died in the first 100 years after contact. 9 out of 10 people, not from war, from germs. The same thing happened in the Pacific. Places like Hawaii and Easter Island saw their populations crash after outsiders brought in new diseases. Even a simple cold could be deadly. Nobody's immune system was prepared. Now zoom in on North Sentinel Island. That bubble of isolation means the people there have only ever faced local diseases. They have no defences against the common germs that most people around the world shrug off. If someone lands on the beach with a cough, or a scratch, or a fever, they're carrying invisible weapons: measles, flu, chickenpox, Things that seem mild to us could wipe out a big part of the population there. There's real evidence of this, even though we can't study the islanders directly. Look at what happened to the other Andamanese tribes. The Great Andamanese once had thousands of people. After British contact in the 1800s, their numbers dropped to a few dozen. Diseases like measles and influenza tore through their villages. The survivors still carry scars, some literally, some in their family trees, broken and scattered. The Ongenjarawa faced the same fate. Even with some contact and a few medical supplies, their populations fell fast after outsiders arrived. The pattern is clear. Isolation protects, but it also creates weakness. When the wall of disease breaks, the results are quick and brutal. Here's a closer example. In 1880, when the British tried to make contact with the Sentinelese, they took a family, 2 adults and 2 children, off the island. The adults died within days, likely from diseases their bodies couldn't fight. The children were sent back to the island with gifts. But who knows what germs they carried back with them? It's a small detail in the records, but it hints at how easily an infection could spread. The British didn't know or didn't care. Either way, the damage was done. Now think about modern times. There have been a few accidental contacts. Shipwrecked fishermen, lost tourists, even a missionary who tried to bring Christianity to the island in 2018. Most of these people didn't last long. The islanders defended themselves with arrows and spears. But before the outsiders died or were chased away, they might have left behind something deadlier than weapons, germs. It only takes one sick person, one cough, one contaminated object washed up on the beach. That's all it takes to shatter the invisible wall that's protected the island for so long. So why don't we see mass die-offs every time someone comes close? That's a good question. Part of the answer is luck. Most people who end up on the island don't survive long enough to interact closely. The Sentinelese are careful. They keep their distance. They collect gifts left on the sand, but they do it with sticks. Sometimes they burn the objects before taking them home. Maybe they've learned over generations that anything from the outside could be dangerous, or maybe they've just seen what happened to their neighbours. The stories might not be told in our words, but the lesson is clear. Strangers bring death. Better to avoid them. Better to drive them away. There's also the possibility that the wall hasn't been breached. Yet. Maybe the last few contacts didn't carry the worst diseases. Maybe the germs didn't survive long enough to spread. It could be that the right or wrong set of circumstances just hasn't lined up. But history shows that sooner or later, luck runs out. Let's talk about how disease can wipe out a group like this. Imagine a new germ arrives, a flu virus, for example. In most places, maybe 1 in 100 people die from a bad flu. But in an isolated group, it could be 30 or 40 out of 100. The survivors might be too weak to hunt or gather food. Children and elders would be hit hardest. The whole social structure could break down. One bad epidemic, and the population could fall below the point of recovery. And it's not just about numbers. Disease can change the way people live. If most of the adults die, who teaches the children? Who remembers the old stories, the hunting grounds, the best places to fish? A culture can vanish even if a few bodies survive. There's another layer here. Diseases don't just kill. Some leave lasting damage. Measles, for example, can cause blindness or brain damage. Even if people survive, they might not be able to live the way they used to. They might not be able to care for children or find food. One wave of sickness can echo for generations. You might wonder, couldn't medicine help? Couldn't doctors land on the island and give everyone vaccines? In theory, yes. In reality, it's not that simple. First, the Sentinelese have made it clear. They don't want outsiders. They see any attempt at contact as a threat. Even if the best doctors in the world showed up with vaccines and clean needles, they'd be met with arrows and hostility. Forcing help on them would be an act of violence, not kindness. Second, vaccines work best when people have some background immunity. For many shots, you need booster doses, or a certain age or a certain health status. There's no easy way to organise this without a complete change in their way of life. You'd have to bring people together, set up clinics, keep records. It's not possible without destroying their independence. Plus, introducing new medical tools brings its own risks. Needles, packaging, even the doctors themselves could carry germs. There's no way to make the process completely safe. Some people have suggested dropping vaccines or medicines from planes. But even that could go wrong. The islanders might see it as an attack. They might not trust the objects, or the medicine could go bad in the heat and humidity before anyone uses it. The truth is, the wall of disease is almost impossible to cross without causing harm. The very thing that protects the Sentinelese, their distance from the rest of the world, is also what puts them in danger whenever that distance is broken. Let's look at another angle. Over the years, there have been rare moments when people tried to bring gifts, coconuts, iron tools, even live pigs. The islanders sometimes accepted the coconuts, but when a pig was left on the beach, they killed it and buried it, refusing to eat it. Maybe they saw it as a threat. Maybe they remembered past disasters. Either way, they understood, in their own way, that not everything from outside is safe. This kind of caution isn't just fear, it's survival. It's a lesson carried forward from somewhere deep in their history. A lesson written not in books, but in the choices people make when strangers appear. There's also the question of what happens if the disease will break slowly instead of all at once. Sometimes new germs don't kill right away. They might cause chronic illnesses, things like tuberculosis or hepatitis. These diseases can weaken people over time, making it harder to survive other hardships. The impact builds up year after year until the group is too weak to recover. That's what happened to other isolated groups. The Great Andamanese didn't just die from sudden epidemics. Some survived but were never truly healthy again. Their population kept shrinking, even after the first wave of contact. The same could happen on North Sentinel Island. A slow-motion disaster, invisible except in smaller families, weaker children, fewer elders. Let's step back and ask, why are isolated groups so much more vulnerable? It comes down to the way diseases and immune systems evolve together. In big populations, germs spread and mutate quickly. People who survive pass on genetic traits that help fight the disease. Over time, the population gets stronger. In small, isolated groups, there's less chance for this kind of evolution. The same families, the same genes, the same immune responses. When a new germ arrives, nobody has any built-in defenses. The disease spreads fast and everyone gets sick at once. There's no buffer. No one to care for the sick, no one to keep things running. Now think about the bigger world. Most people alive today carry the marks of ancient epidemics in their DNA, genes that helped ancestors survive the Black Death in Europe, for example, or malaria in Africa. These genes are like battle scars. But the Sentinelese, cut off for so long, missed out on all those ancient battles. Their DNA never had to fight smallpox or plague. They're immune. Systems were shaped by different battles. Maybe worms, maybe tropical fevers, but not the big, fast-killing diseases that swept through cities and continents. That's what makes the disease wall so important and so fragile. It's both a shield and a trap. You might be wondering if this kind of extreme vulnerability could ever change. The answer is complicated. Some scientists have wondered if slow, careful contact, maybe with strict quarantine, maybe with years of planning, could help. But even the best plans carry risks, and the history of other groups shows that even careful efforts can fail. All it takes is one mistake. There's another idea. Maybe the islanders have built up some resistance to outside germs. Maybe they've been exposed to things that drifted in on the wind, or in the water, or from rare shipwrecks. Maybe they're tougher than we think. But the evidence from other Andamanese groups suggests that's not enough. Small populations can't build herd immunity the way bigger groups can. There just aren't enough people for the disease to burn through slowly, giving survivors a chance to pass on resistance. So the wall stands for now. But it takes constant vigilance. One slip, one accident, one unwanted visitor, and everything could change. It's a strange way to live, always on guard against the outside world. But for the people of North Sentinel Island, it's normal. It's life. It's how their ancestors survived when other groups vanished. Here's what strikes me most. The same things that make them vulnerable also make them unique. Their culture, their language, their way of life. These exist because the wall held. Because no one got close enough to bring disaster. Their independence is both a gift and a risk. You could look at the disease wall as a kind of tragic barrier, or you could see it as a line of defense that's lasted longer than any wall built from stone or wood. It's invisible, but it's real. It's kept them alive when so many others faded away. What happens next depends on everyone else, on the choices outsiders make, on whether the world can respect a boundary that's not marked on any map or guarded by soldiers, but is just as important. A boundary made of breath, blood, and memory. For now, the disease wall stands. The people behind it carry on, hunting, gathering, raising children, telling stories that nobody else will ever hear. Their world is small, but it's whole. The cost of breaking the wall is almost too high to imagine, and so the island waits. The rest of the world watches from a distance. No one knows how long the wall will last, but for now, it's holding. That fragile, invisible line between life and loss, between memory and forgetting. Next, we'll step out of the world of danger and look at something different. What holds them together? Not just fear, not just walls, but the deep beliefs that shape their lives. What do they trust? What do they hope for? What keeps their world whole, even when everything outside is changing? Let's try to imagine what the people of North Sentinel Island might actually believe. Not what we guess, or what outside experts think, but what could be real for them. It's a strange exercise because we have almost no hard facts. No written stories, no interviews, no friendly talks on the beach. All we can do is start with what we know about human nature, about isolated groups, and about how cultures usually work when they're left on their own for hundreds of generations. But that's what makes this so interesting. It's like trying to picture an entire world through a keyhole. First, think about the island itself. North Sentinel is about the size of Manhattan, but covered in thick forest and ringed by coral reefs. There are no roads, no fields, no signs of farming. There's the sea, the forest, the sky, and the ever-present sound of waves. That's the whole universe for anyone born there. You wake up every morning to the same trees, the same birds, the same wind. The sun rises over the ocean and sets behind the forest. There's no horizon full of cities, no distant mountains, just the endless blue and green. For a long time, this would shape your sense of the world. The island is the centre. Everything you need is here. Food, water, shelter, family, and whatever spirits or powers you believe in. Beyond that, there's only danger. The sea is both a wall and a source of life. It brings fish, turtles, maybe the occasional drifting object, but it also keeps other people away. For most of your life, you'd never see a face you didn't know. So, what kind of beliefs come from a world like this? Anthropologists have studied other isolated groups, and certain patterns show up again and again. People tend to build their stories around the land they know. They give names to rocks, trees, and rivers. They create myths about how the world began and how their people arrived. Sometimes the story is that their ancestors emerged from the ground, or came down from the sky, or were made by some powerful being. The important part is that the land and the people are connected. They belong to each other. If you grow up in a place where every path, every tree, every stretch of beach has a story, then your sense of history is tied to the land itself. You don't need a written record. The stories are passed on by word of mouth, taught to children by parents and elders. Maybe there are special places where rituals happen, clearings in the woods, or certain trees that mark the boundaries between different groups. There could be sacred spots for birth, for death, for coming of age. These places matter more than anything outside. Now let's think about language. The Sentinelese language is completely unknown to outsiders. It's not closely related to any other language we know. That means it's probably very old, maybe thousands of years old, changing slowly, as each new generation learns to speak. Language shapes thought. If you don't have words for foreigner or city or country, those things barely exist in your mind. Maybe there are only words for us and not us. Maybe the only outsiders are spirits, animals, or the occasional dangerous visitor. It's likely that their language is full of words for things that matter to them. Fish, birds, weather, tools, plants, and the relationships between families. There might be dozens of words for different kinds of wood, or for the tides at certain times of year. Think about how, in some Arctic cultures, there are many words for snow. On North Sentinel, there might be just as many for the patterns of the waves or the shapes of the clouds before a storm. Belief systems in small, isolated societies are usually practical. They're about survival. But they also explain the unknown. Why does someone get sick? Why does the weather change? Why do good things, or bad, things happen? Without science, people often turn to spirits or ancestors for answers. Maybe there are taboos, rules about what you can eat, who you can marry, or where you can go. Breaking these taboos could bring bad luck or sickness. You might believe that the island itself has a spirit, or that certain animals are messengers. Maybe the forest is alive with invisible beings, some friendly, some dangerous. When something strange washes up on the beach, a piece of metal, a plastic bottle, even a shipwreck, it could be seen as a sign from the spirits, or as a test. Some things are accepted, others are burned or hidden. Let's get more specific. In many hunter-gatherer cultures, there's a strong sense of respect for the animals they hunt. Maybe there are rituals to thank the animal spirit, or rules about how to use every part of the body. Waste is frowned upon, sharing is important. The group survives together, or not at all. Food is given to those who need it. Most, children, elders, pregnant women. Social rules are enforced not by police or laws, but by custom and group pressure. Leadership is usually informal. The person with the most knowledge, or the best skills, might have more influence, but there's rarely a king or chief. Decisions are made by talking, by consensus. Elders are respected for their memories, their stories, and their ability to keep the group safe. Now, let's try to picture what happens when something truly strange appears. Maybe a boat floats in after a storm, carrying objects nobody has seen before. Iron, glass, cloth, maybe even the body of a drowned sailor. For people who've never seen metal tools, this is magic. It's both a gift and a threat. Some things are useful. Iron can be shaped into knives or arrowheads. But there's also fear. Where did it come from? Is it safe to touch? Stories would grow around these objects. Maybe the spirit sent them. Maybe they're a warning. If people get sick after using something from the sea, it could be blamed on breaking a taboo or on angering the ancestors. Over time, these beliefs become part of the culture. Maybe there are rituals for cleansing new objects, or rules about who can touch them. When outsiders approach, as they sometimes do, the reaction is almost always defensive. Arrows, shouts, and hiding in the forest. This makes sense if you think about the past. If the first visits brought sickness, or violence, or just confusion, then the group would quickly learn to avoid all strangers. Stories would spread. Never trust the people who come from the sea. They look strange, they act strange, and nothing good follows them. Some people might be chosen to watch the shore, to warn others if boats appear. Maybe there are special words or signals for this. Maybe children are taught from a young age to hide, to stay away from the beach when strangers come. Over time, this becomes second nature. It's not just fear, it's wisdom, passed down from those who survived. Let's talk about family and community. In a group that small, everyone is related in some way. You grow up surrounded by cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents. Marriage rules would be strict to avoid inbreeding as much as possible. Maybe there are rituals for choosing partners, or rules about living with the husband's family or the wife's. Children are raised by the whole group. Older kids help care for the younger ones. Elders teach by example, telling stories at night or showing the right way to hunt or gather food. There's probably a deep respect for tradition. Change comes slowly, if at all. If someone tries something new and it works, maybe others copy it. But if it fails, it's quickly forgotten. The system is built for survival, for keeping the group together in a world where mistakes can be deadly. Now, think about what they might believe about the stars, the sun, and the moon. With no electric lights and few distractions, the night sky is a huge presence. Maybe there are stories about the shapes of the stars or about spirits that travel across the sky. Eclipses might be seen as powerful omens. The cycle of the moon could guide when to hunt, when to fish, or when to hold certain rituals. Weather is another big force. Storms are dangerous on a small island. Maybe there are dances or songs to ask for protection, or to thank the spirits for safe passage through the rainy season. The sea too is both friend and enemy. Calm waters mean good fishing. Rough seas bring danger. Maybe there are old stories about a time when the island was bigger, or when it was joined to other lands. These stories might encode real memories of rising sea levels or disasters passed down for hundreds of years. Let's look at death. In most cultures, death is explained by stories about what happens next. Maybe the spirit leaves the body and travels somewhere else. Maybe the ancestors watch over the living. How bodies are treated matters. A burial, a special place, or a ritual to send the spirit on its way. These practices help people deal with grief and also keep the group feeling whole. What about outsiders? Do they have a place in these beliefs? Maybe there are legends about dangerous people who come from the sea. Maybe the stories warn about what happens if you talk to them or accept their gifts. Over generations, these tales grow stronger, especially if there have been real disasters in the past. The fear isn't just about violence, but about what happens if the group changes too much, or if the balance with the spirits is broken. Let's think about hope. In a world so small and tightly knit, hope might look different than it does in big societies. Maybe it's about surviving another year, raising healthy children, making it through the storms. Maybe it's about passing on the old stories, keeping the group together, and honouring the land. The idea of progress, as we think of it, might not matter much. Instead, the focus is on stability, on repeating the cycle, on doing things the way the ancestors did. But even in the most traditional groups, people are curious. Children ask questions. Someone tries a new way to make a tool, or finds a better fishing spot. Not all change is bad. Some things stick and slowly culture shifts. Maybe a new way of weaving baskets or a different kind of arrowhead becomes popular. Maybe a clever solution spreads from one family to another. Over time, even small changes add up. But the pace is slow, there's no rush. Life is measured in seasons, in the growth of children, in the passing of elders. Each person is a link in a chain stretching back farther than anyone can remember. Now here's something I think about a lot. When you're cut off from the rest of the world, your sense of what's possible is completely different. You don't dream of flying in airplanes or sailing to other lands. Your world ends at the edge of the forest, or where the reef meets the sea. Maybe you wonder about what lies beyond, but the stories always bring you back to what's known, what's safe. That doesn't mean there's no imagination. Maybe there are dreamers, people who see patterns in the clouds or have visions after eating certain plants. Maybe these people become healers, or storytellers, or leaders in times of trouble. Every society has its visionaries, but their dreams are shaped by the world they know. There's also the idea of us and them. In a place like North Sentinel, the line is clear. Us, the people you see every day. Them, anyone or anything from outside. The stories, the rules, the very language is built around this line. It's a way to keep the group safe, but it also shapes how people see themselves. Maybe, over generations, these beliefs get stronger. Each time something from outside brings trouble, the stories grow sharper. More warnings, more taboos. The group becomes even more closed, even more protective of its boundaries. But maybe, just maybe, there's room for kindness too. When a strange object washes up, maybe someone remembers a story of a gift from the sea. Maybe they share or leave offerings just in case. Human nature is complicated. Even in the most isolated places, people can surprise you. So what do the Sentinelese believe? We can't say for sure. But if history is any guide, their world is built on stories of the land, the sea, the spirits, and the people who came before. Their rules are about survival, but also about meaning, why things happen, how to keep the group safe, how to stay connected to the past. It's easy to look at a group like this and see only what's missing. No writing, no technology, no great monuments. But maybe what matters most is what's been kept. A way of life that's lasted for thousands of years. A language spoken by no one else. A set of beliefs and traditions that make sense in a world where the outside is always a threat, but the inside is home. That's the mystery. Not just what they know, but what they believe. Not just what's in their minds, but what's in their hearts. The stories that tie them to each other and to a place that, for them, is everything. Next, we'll shift from speculation to a deeper question. Even if we could learn their secrets, should we? Where is the line between curiosity and respect? That's where the real ethical puzzle begins. So let's get into the real heart of it. The big ethical question. Should we ever try to contact a group like the Sentinelese? Is it right to leave them alone forever? Or is there some point where we have a duty to step in? These are not just interesting questions for a debate club. They matter in the real world, for real people. And there are no easy answers. Most of us grow up learning that knowledge is good. Curiosity is good. Reaching out to others is good. But when it comes to people who have chosen isolation or who have never been given a choice, the rules start to break down. There's a long history of outsiders thinking they know best. Sometimes it's dressed up as help. Sometimes it's called progress. But the results, as we've seen with other tribes, are almost always painful. Let's start with the most basic argument, the right to be left alone. Imagine if someone tried to land on your property, walk into your home, and start asking questions. Most people would say, "No way, that's my space, you don't belong here." Now scale that up to an entire society. The people on North Sentinel have made it very clear over and over that they want nothing to do with strangers. They shoot arrows, they hide, they avoid all contact. This isn't just a random reaction, it's a message. Some people see this and say, well, that's their choice. We should respect it. It sounds simple, But it gets complicated fast. What if there's a threat they don't know about? What if a storm or a disease or a food shortage puts them in danger? Do we just sit back and watch? Or do we step in, even if they don't want us? Here's where it gets tricky. Most countries, including India, have laws that make it illegal to go near North Sentinel, not just for safety, but to protect the Sentinelese from harm. The law says, stay away. This is pretty unusual. Most governments want to pull everyone into the fold, to count them in the census, to give them ID cards, to teach them the official language. But in this case, the law is a wall, not a bridge. There's a reason for this. History is full of disasters that started with a handshake. When outsiders meet isolated groups, things can go wrong fast. Germs spread, people die, old ways vanish almost overnight. Sometimes it takes just one visit, one cough, one handshake, one shared meal. The group gets sick and there's no going back. So, the argument goes, better to leave them alone. Let them live the way they want. For as long as they want. This sounds fair, but there's another side. What if the group isn't making a real choice? What if they're trapped by fear or by stories passed down from a time when outsiders really were a threat? Is it right to let fear rule forever? And what if a disaster strikes, like a tsunami or a fire or a sudden drop in their numbers? Do we just hope for the best? Some people say, yes, it's their life. They get to decide. Others say, if we can help, we should. This is where the debate really heats up. Let's look at examples from other places. In the Amazon rainforest, there are still a few groups that avoid all contact. Sometimes loggers or miners find them by accident. Sometimes the government tries to set up no-go zones to keep outsiders away. But the forest is shrinking. Roads keep pushing in. Sometimes people argue that it's better to reach out now, slowly, before disaster hits. The idea is to build trust, to offer help, to give vaccines or medical care before it's too late. But even this gentle approach has problems. How do you decide what's best for someone else? How do you know what they really want if you don't speak their language? And what if your idea of help doesn't match theirs at all? There are stories from the past that should make us think twice. In the 1800s, British officials tried to rescue people from other Andaman Islands. They brought them to the main settlement, gave them clothes, food and medicine. Most of the time people got sick. They died in large numbers, their old ways faded, their languages started to disappear. What the British saw as kindness ended up being a slow disaster. This is why many experts today say do nothing. Not out of laziness, but out of caution. Sometimes the best way to help is to stay away. But that answer feels cold to some people. It's hard to watch a group struggle with problems we know how to fix. This brings up another point, the idea of universal rights. The United Nations says that all people have certain rights, like the right to health, to education, to freedom from violence. But what happens when a group's own customs look very different? What if they don't have schools, or hospitals, or even a written language? Do we say that's wrong, or do we say that's their way? It gets even trickier when you think about children. If a group has strict rules, or harsh punishments, or doesn't give kids a choice about how to live, is that okay? Or do we have a duty to step in? Most people would agree that children should be protected from real harm. But who decides what counts as harm? In many cultures, things that seem cruel to outsiders are seen as normal, or even loving, by the people who live there. Let's talk about knowledge for a minute. There's a strong pull to learn as much as we can about people like the Sentinelese. Scientists, historians, and regular folks are all curious. Some want to study their language, their tools, their genes. The idea is that every group has something to teach us about human nature, about survival, about what's possible. But here's the hard truth. Studying people who don't want to be studied is risky. The act of watching, recording, or collecting things can be a form of invasion. Even flying drones or taking photos from far away can feel like spying, and once you start gathering knowledge, it's hard to control how it's used. Sometimes the stories get twisted. Sometimes the group's privacy is lost forever. There's also the issue of othering. When we look at a group and see only what's different, we risk turning them into a curiosity instead of seeing them as people. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking, they're so strange, so alien. But in reality, they're just people living in a way that's worked for them for a very long time. Some people say, but what about progress? Don't we have a duty to share what we've learned? Medicine, technology, ways to make life safer? It's a good question. Modern life has its comforts. Fewer children die young. People live longer. But progress also comes with big costs. Once you open the door, you can't close it again. The old ways vanish fast. Sometimes the group loses not just their lifestyle, but their sense of who they are. Here's another angle. Some thinkers argue that true respect means letting people make their own mistakes. If a group is in danger from disease or hunger or changing weather, maybe we should offer help, but only if they ask for it. The problem is, with groups like the Sentinelese, there's no easy way for them to ask. Their signals are all defensive. Arrows, hiding, silence. So do we wait for a sign that may never come? Or do we trust that if they really needed us, they'd find a way? There's also a practical side to all this. Even if we wanted to help, even if we had the best intentions, there's no guarantee we'd succeed. The risk of bringing disease is huge. The risk of cultural collapse is even bigger. And the truth is, outsiders have a bad track record with this kind of thing. Some people suggest a middle road. Maybe we set up a system to watch from a distance. Use satellites to check for signs of trouble, fires, storms, changes in the landscape. Maybe we train people to respond only in the case of a true emergency, like after a tsunami. This sounds sensible, but even this can feel like interference. Who decides what counts as an emergency? Who gets to take charge? Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Every time outsiders have tried to help isolated groups, it started with good intentions. But the world is full of stories where good intentions led to tragedy. Missionaries brought new gods, but also new diseases. Traders brought tools, but also alcohol and addiction. Governments brought roads, but also bulldozers and forced change. Some say, but that was the past. We know better now. Maybe, but the dangers haven't gone away. The same risks exist. The same problems can appear, and the people who pay the price are always the most vulnerable. The children, the elders, the ones who can't fight back. There's also the question of time. Should we just wait and see what happens? Maybe, over generations, the group will change on their own. Maybe one day, someone will walk out of the forest and ask for help. Or maybe they'll never want that. Maybe their best chance is to keep doing what they've always done. This is where philosophy meets real life. What does it mean to live a good life? For the Sentinelese, maybe it means fishing, hunting, raising children, telling stories and repeating the old ways. For others, it means learning, growing, connecting with the wider world. Who gets to decide which is better? Here's something to chew on. If we believe that all people are equal, then their wishes matter as much as ours, even if we don't agree with their choices, even if we think we know better. Respect isn't just about leaving someone alone, it's about letting them shape their own future. But what if their world is changing fast from things they can't control? Rising sea levels, new diseases, or even the odd object washing up from the sea. At some point the world will reach them, whether we want it to or not. So maybe the real question is not, should we contact them? But how do we prepare for the day when contact happens by accident? Some experts say the best plan is to have support ready just in case. Emergency teams with vaccines, translators and supplies. Quiet, careful steps, not big, loud ones. But always with the understanding that the group gets to decide what happens next. There's one more layer to this. The Sentinelese are not just a puzzle for scientists or a problem for governments. They're a reminder that there are still places in the world where mystery survives, where not everything is mapped, explained or controlled. In a time when it feels like every corner of the earth is known, maybe that's worth protecting. Leaving a group alone is not the same as ignoring them. It's an active choice. It means watching, waiting, and being ready to help, but only if the need is clear and if help is wanted. It means accepting that some questions may never be answered, some doors may never open. So the ethical debate is not really about them. It's about us, about our patience, our respect, our willingness to let other ways of life exist, even if they make us uncomfortable. It's about learning to live with mystery, to let some stories stay untold. And maybe, in the end, that's a kind of wisdom too. Not every secret needs to be unlocked. Not every path needs to be followed. Sometimes the best thing we can do is watch from a distance and let the story unfold in its own time. As we look beyond this one island, these same questions start to appear everywhere. How do we treat other groups who choose a different way? What do we owe to people who don't share our dreams, our fears, or even our language? The answers aren't simple, but the questions are worth asking. If you zoom out and look at the big picture, the Sentinelese aren't just one strange chapter in human history. They're a living example of something rare, a group that has managed to hold on to their independence even when the rest of the world has changed beyond recognition. Most places on Earth have been mapped, measured, and pulled into a network of borders, laws, and trade. But here, it's different. Here, an entire society keeps moving to its own rhythm, untouched by most of what we'd call modern life. That's pretty wild when you think about it. While nearly every other group has been drawn into bigger and bigger systems, kingdoms, empires, countries, global trade, the people on this island have resisted all of it. No roads, no electricity, no written language as far as anyone knows, no coins or money, no government in the way we understand it, just families and clans, living as they always have. But is this really as unique as it seems? Or are there other examples, other last guardians of old ways, scattered around the world? To get a better grip on this, let's look at some places where people have tried to keep outsiders at bay and see how it played out. Start with the Amazon. Deep in the forest, there are a handful of groups who still try to avoid contact. One of the best known are the Mashco Piro in Peru. For years, they lived deep in the forest, moving camps, hiding from loggers and missionaries. Sometimes they shot arrows at boats or people who got too close. Sometimes they just disappeared into the trees, but the forest is shrinking. Roads and rivers now cut through places that used to be safe. Outsiders bring food, tools, and sometimes diseases. Sometimes groups like the Mashco Piro come out to the riverbank, asking for pots or machetes. Sometimes they just want to watch. But every contact comes with risk. In the past 10 years, there have been more and more sightings, more photos, more outsiders talking about them like they're a mystery to be solved. The story often goes the same way. The group tries to stay away, but the outside world closes in. At first, people are curious. Then the pressure builds. Loggers want the land, companies want the trees, governments want everyone counted and registered. In some cases, the group gets pushed out of their land entirely. Their old ways start to fade. They're forced to move or to accept help they didn't ask for. But here's the strange thing. Even when contact finally happens, it doesn't always go the same way. Sometimes the group absorbs some new things and keeps most of their old life. Other times, the changes are too much. People get sick. Old leaders lose their power. Young people start to leave, drawn by the promise of something different. The whole culture can shift in just a few years. Now let's look at Papua New Guinea. Until the 1930s, there were huge areas where outsiders had never set foot. Whole valleys full of villages, gardens and languages nobody else knew. When Australian explorers finally entered the highlands, they found about 1 million people living traditional lives, stone tools, farming by hand, no metal, no writing. There were hundreds of different languages, more than anywhere else on Earth. The first visits were full of misunderstandings. Outsiders thought the locals were dangerous. The locals thought the newcomers were spirits or ghosts. Some groups ran away, others tried to fight, but eventually roads were built. Planes landed, traders arrived. The old ways didn't vanish overnight, but they started to change. Today, most people in Papua New Guinea still live in villages, but almost everyone has felt the pull of the outside world. They buy plastic buckets, they use cell phones. Some kids go to school, some don't. The highlands of New Guinea show that, even in places where contact comes late, change is hard to stop once it starts. Some traditions survive, some don't. But the pace of change is always faster when the gap between worlds is so wide. Another example, the reindeer herders in Siberia. The Nenets have lived on the tundra for thousands of years. They move with the seasons, following the herds. In the Soviet era, the government tried to force them into villages. They built schools, sent in doctors, tried to teach Russian ways. Some Nenets adapted. Others kept moving, holding on to their language and beliefs. Today there are still families who drive their reindeer sleds across the snow, living much as their ancestors did. But even here, life is changing. Oil companies want the land. Climate change is making travel harder. The old routes are melting. The Nenet story is a little different from the others. They never fully cut themselves off. They traded with neighbours, learned new words, sometimes even sent their kids to school. But they always tried to keep control over their way of life. When outsiders pushed too hard, the Nenets resisted. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But the core idea was the same. Don't let someone else decide your future. If you look at all these examples, a pattern starts to appear. Isolation can last a long time, but it almost always ends when outside pressure gets too strong. Sometimes the pressure is slow, a new road, a logging crew, a government policy. Sometimes it's sudden, a new disease, a big storm, or a violent clash. But once the door is open, it's hard to close it again. And yet, there are a few places where the old ways hang on, almost untouched. North Sentinel is the clearest case, but there are others. In the Pacific, some small islands have kept outsiders away for centuries. The island of Niihau in Hawaii is owned by one family. Only native Hawaiians and invited guests are allowed. They speak their own version of Hawaiian, grow their own food and keep most modern things out. But even here, it's not total isolation. People have radios, sometimes go to the bigger islands, and know about the world beyond. So what's different about the Sentinelese? Why has their world lasted so long, mostly unchanged? Part of the answer is geography. Their island is hard to reach. The reefs and waves make landing dangerous. The forest is thick. There are no easy places to build or farm. Plus, the people themselves are very clear. Strangers are not welcome, but geography isn't the whole story. There's also timing. The first outsiders didn't show up until the late 1800s. By then, the world was already filled with stories of what happened when contact went wrong. Disease, violence, loss of land. The people who tried to visit North Sentinel learned quickly that it was safer to stay away. Then there's the role of governments. In most places, the goal has always been to bring every group under control, to teach, to convert, to count. But in the Andaman Islands, after too many disasters, the rules changed. Instead of forcing contact, the policy became, let them be. The Coast Guard patrols the waters around the island. Signs warn boats not to land. Helicopters fly by but rarely get close. It's a kind of invisible fence built of law and caution. This is rare. In most of the world, governments don't leave land or people outside their reach for long. There's always a reason to push in. Resources, security, curiosity, or just the idea that everyone should be included. But here, the rules flipped. The goal is to keep the island separate, even if it means turning away scientists, journalists, and even rescue teams. Let's look at numbers for a second. Around the world, there are only a few dozen groups still living with little or no outside contact. Some in the Amazon, a few in Papua New Guinea, a handful in the Congo, maybe 100,000 people. Total. That's out of nearly 8 billion people on Earth. It's like a tiny pebble in a huge river. But even among these groups, the Sentinelese are probably the most isolated. No friendly visits, no trade, no shared ceremonies, no missionaries, no traders, no government officials. Just the sea, the forest, and their own stories. Why does this matter? For one thing, it challenges the idea that all roads lead to the same place. Most societies, when left alone, eventually build cities, invent writing, or start trading with neighbours. But here, none of that happened. The same basic tools, the same way of living, the same small group repeating the cycle year after year. Some people see this as a kind of time capsule, a window into the distant past. But that's not really fair. The people on the island aren't living fossils, they're not frozen in time. They've changed and adapted just in their own way. They use iron from shipwrecks. They build new kinds of huts when storms hit. They teach their children skills that have worked for generations. But the main thing is, they've kept control over their story. No one else gets to decide for them. That's almost unheard of today. There's another angle to all this. The role of myth and imagination. For people looking in from the outside, the island becomes a blank screen. We project our dreams and fears onto it. Some see it as a paradise, pure, untouched, free from the problems of modern life. Others see it as a warning, a reminder of what can be lost when people shut themselves off. But the truth is, it's neither. It's just a group of people doing their best to survive in a place that isn't easy. What strikes me most is how much uncertainty there still is. We don't know how many people live there. Maybe 50, maybe 100. We don't know their language. We don't know their names. We don't know how they organise themselves or what they dream about at night. All we have are glimpses. A figure on the beach, a flash of a fire through the trees, a raft drifting in the surf, and that's kind of amazing in a world where you can zoom in on almost any spot on Earth with a phone. Here, there are still places where questions outnumber answers, but there's also a cost. When a group stays cut off, they miss out on things that others take for granted. Medicine, new ideas, tools that make life safer or easier. If a new disease spreads, they have no defence. If the weather changes, they have to adapt on their own. And if their numbers drop too low, there may not be enough people left to keep the way of life going. So some people ask, how long can this last? Is it possible for a group to stay separate forever? Or is it just a matter of time before something breaks through, by accident or by force, or by slow change? History gives mixed answers. Some groups hold on for centuries, then fade away quickly. Others blend into bigger societies, keeping bits of their old ways. A few, like the Sentinelese, manage to stand apart, at least for now. Here's one last thing to think about. Every group that's managed to keep outsiders at bay has done so with a mix of luck, geography, and stubbornness. Sometimes it's because their land is hard to reach. Sometimes it's because they're fierce or because outsiders are afraid. Sometimes it's just because nobody noticed them for a long time. But once the outside world comes knocking, the old balance is hard to keep. Even small things, a boat landing by mistake, a lost fisherman, a plastic bottle washing up, can start the process of change. People like to imagine that there are secrets left in the world, lost cities, hidden tribes, places where time stands still. But the truth is, the world is shrinking. Satellites map every coast. Drones fly over forests. Even the most remote places are never fully safe from change. So maybe the real lesson here isn't about the Sentinelese at all. Maybe it's about us, about our hunger to know, to reach, to connect, about the choices we make when faced with something we can't fully understand. Do we break down the door just because we can? Or do we stand back and let some mysteries stay mysteries? There's no easy answer. But the evidence from all over the world shows one thing clearly. When outsiders push too hard, the old ways usually disappear. Sometimes that brings new chances. Sometimes it brings pain and loss. But once things move, you can't rewind the tape. So the people on that island are not just holding on to their own story. They're holding a mirror up to the rest of us. They ask without words, can you let something exist even if you don't get to know all the answers? In a way, they're the last guardians, not just of their own way of life, but of the idea that not everything has to be explained, mapped, or changed. That some corners of the world can still belong to themselves, and as the world gets smaller and faster, maybe that's more important than ever. Maybe the hardest thing is not to explore, but to protect the right to mystery. That's the evidence. That's what history shows us, over and over. The Last Guardians aren't just protecting their island. They're showing us that there's still space for wonder even now. Let's really dig into what could be lost if the world on North Sentinel ever disappears. What's at stake isn't just the end of a tribe, or the vanishing of a curious story from the news. It's something bigger and stranger, something that's hard to explain, but you can feel it if you let yourself imagine the edges of their world. Start with language. The people on North Sentinel speak a tongue that no one else on Earth understands. Not one outsider has ever learned it, not even a single word for sure. No one knows what they call themselves, how they greet each other, or what stories they tell at night. If their way of life ends, that language goes with them. It's not just a code or a set of words, it's a whole way of seeing the world. Every language has its own shapes, its own music, its own ideas that can't be said any other way. Think about all the things that are tucked inside a language. Words for plants that only grow in their forest. Terms for the sea, the wind, the way the light changes in the trees. Maybe they have words for feelings we don't even have names for. Maybe they have jokes and songs that only make sense if you've lived your whole life on that bit of land. When a language dies, all of that gets erased. It's like burning a library you never got to visit. Now picture their knowledge. The people on that island know things that no outsider has ever learned. How to find fresh water in the jungle. Which roots and leaves you can eat, which will make you sick, which will help a wound heal. They can read the weather by looking at the sea. They know how to fish with simple tools, how to build shelters that stand up to storms, how to move quietly through the forest without leaving tracks. This isn't just primitive skill. It's a kind of genius, shaped by living in one place for who knows how many generations. There are stories of other islanders in the Andamans who could see fish underwater from far away, or who knew when a storm was coming just by the smell in the air. Maybe the people on North Sentinel can do things like that too. Maybe they have tricks for surviving that we've forgotten, things that would surprise even the best outdoors experts. If their way of life ends, all that hard-won knowledge is gone. not just for them, but for everyone. There's also the question of identity. The people on the island have never been counted, never had passports, never been part of a country in any real way. They've never paid taxes or followed laws, made far away. Their identity isn't tied to a flag or a government. It's built from family, land, memory, and the patterns of daily life. They belong to the island, and the island belongs to them. If you take that away, what happens? It's not just a matter of moving to a new house or learning new rules. Whole ways of being yourself can vanish. In other places, when groups have been forced to join bigger societies, people often lose their sense of who they are. Old names disappear. Traditional tattoos or markings fade. Songs and dances get forgotten. People start to feel lost, even if their bodies are safe. History is full of examples. When Native American children were sent to boarding schools, they were told to stop speaking their own languages, to cut their hair, to forget their old ways. Many grew up never feeling at home in either world. The same thing happened in Australia, Canada, and places all over Africa and Asia. The culture wasn't just changed, it was broken, often on purpose. So when you ask what might be lost if the people on North Sentinel lose their world, it's not just the end of a tribe, it's the loss of a whole way of being human. A different answer to the question, how should we live? It's one fewer voice in the conversation of the world. Now let's talk about knowledge that goes beyond survival. Every group on Earth builds its own beliefs, its own ideas about how the universe works. Maybe the people on that island have stories about how the world began. Maybe they have rules for what happens when someone dies, or why storms come, or why a certain tree is sacred. We'll never know the details, but those beliefs are part of what makes life meaningful for them. If those stories vanish, something irreplaceable goes with them. It's not just about religion or myths. It's about the small things too. The way they laugh together, the rhythm of their days, the little rules about who eats first or how to share a catch. These aren't written down, but they hold the group together. Anthropologists call this social glue. Without it, people struggle to trust each other or work together. When an outside system tries to replace that glue, whether it's laws, police, or religion, it almost never fits perfectly. Something always gets lost in the swap. Let's not forget about art either. Maybe the people on North Sentinel make carvings from driftwood. Maybe they decorate their bodies, or sing songs to mark the seasons. Maybe they have dances that only make sense in the moonlight, or patterns they draw in the sand. We'll never see these things. But if they disappear, that's another piece of the human story gone. And here's a strange thought. What if their way of seeing the world is healthier in some ways than ours? Maybe they feel more connected to the land because they've never been cut off from it. Maybe they don't worry about things like money, fame, or social media. Their problems are real: storms, hunger, sickness. But maybe their minds are less crowded by the noise that fills up modern life. If their way of life disappears, we lose the chance to learn from a different model. Some people might say, but they're missing out on so much. Medicine, technology, comfort, safety. That's true in a way. But who decides what counts as missing out? To them, maybe we're the ones who have lost something. Maybe they look at the busy world beyond the waves and see endless stress, pointless arguments, or a kind of emptiness that comes from always wanting more. That's not to say their life is perfect. Of course it's not. There's hunger, fear, accidents, pain. But that's true everywhere. The difference is their answers to life's questions are their own. If their culture disappears, so does their right to decide what matters most. Now let's look at the bigger picture. What does the loss of their world mean for all of us? It's easy to focus on the individual island, but the truth is, every time a unique group vanishes, the whole human family becomes a little more the same. The world gets flatter less interesting, more predictable. It's like losing a colour from the rainbow or a note from a song. Humanity has always thrived on variety. The more ways there are to live, the more ideas there are to share. When the same food, music, language and belief spread everywhere, something important goes missing. We lose options for how to be. We lose the proof that you can live a good life in many different ways. There's a lesson here about humility too. If the people on North Sentinel have survived on their own for so long, maybe there are things they know that we don't. Maybe there are answers hidden in their stories, their skills, their choices. If that world disappears, we lose the chance to ask different questions, to imagine new solutions. Here's another angle. The loss of their isolation could mean the loss of wildness, not just for them, but for the place itself. Their island is one of the last places on Earth where humans live without roads, wires, or machines. The forest, the reefs, the animals are part of their lives. If outsiders come in, even with good intentions, the balance breaks. New plants and animals arrive. The old ones might vanish. The land itself starts to change. There's something powerful about having places on the map that are still unknown, where nature and people live in old patterns. If those places disappear, the world feels a little smaller, a little less magical. This brings up the idea of memory, cultural memory, not just personal. When a unique group ends, their past is lost too. No one will remember the storms of 50 years ago, or the way the forest used to sound, or the tricks for finding fish in the lagoon. Oral histories, passed from parent to child, vanish in a single generation. All those memories gone in a heartbeat, and think about future generations. If the world loses its last truly isolated group, what do we tell our kids? That everywhere is the same, that there are no mysteries left, no places where people can live by their own rules. It's not just about nostalgia, it's about giving people hope that the world can be bigger and stranger than they expect. Sometimes when a group finally joins the outside world, there's a rush to record everything. Words, songs, ways of making fire, recipes, tools. But it's never enough. No book or video can capture the feeling of living the life from birth. The magic is in the doing, not just the telling. Now let's talk about loss on a level that's hard to measure. Spiritual loss. For some people, just knowing that places like North Sentinel exist is comforting. It's a sign that the world hasn't been completely tamed or explained. Some mysteries survive. If that's gone, the world feels a little more empty. There's a kind of hope in knowing that other answers are possible, that other lives are being lived right now that don't fit our grids and rules. If those lives vanish, some people will feel that loss even if they never meet a single person from the island. I think about this sometimes, late at night. The idea that there are still people dreaming under different stars, living by different clocks. It's a reminder that the story of humans isn't finished, and maybe never will be. But the loss isn't just emotional or cultural. There's a practical side too. When a unique group disappears, scientists lose a chance to learn about human health, language, history, and the environment. There are things only they know about surviving disasters, about the plants and animals on their island, maybe even about diseases that outsiders have never seen. Once that knowledge is gone, it's gone forever. And there's a warning in all this. If the world can't protect a group as isolated as the people on North Sentinel, can it protect any small, unique way of life? Or will everything eventually get pulled into one big, tangled web? It's easy to shrug and say, that's just the way the world works. But every loss like this makes the world a little less surprising. It's like reading a book where every chapter ends the same way. The sense of wonder fades. Finally, there's the loss of choice. As long as the people on North Sentinel live by their own rules, they have the power to say yes or no to change. If that's taken away, even for good reasons, the choice is gone, and that's something you can't give back. So what's really at risk? Not just a language, a culture, or a set of skills. What's at risk is the idea that humans can still be different, can still surprise each other, can still protect something rare just because it's rare. The loss would be like a door closing, not just for them, but for all of us. It's not about freezing people in time or turning their lives into a museum. It's about letting one last wild story keep running, even if we're not part of the plot. And in a world where sameness keeps spreading, maybe that's worth more than we realise. Now, as the waves break on those hidden beaches and the fires burn behind the trees, their silence asks a question. What will we do when faced with the possible end of something unique? Will we rush in, or will we find the strength to let it be? Maybe the answer isn't about what we know, but about what we're willing to let stay unknown. That's the real cost at stake, and it's a hard thing to measure, but an even harder thing to get back once it's gone. And as night falls on the island, and on us, let's hold on to the idea that some mysteries are worth keeping, even if we never get to know the whole story. So, what is it really like to live in total isolation? Not just for a few years, but for hundreds of generations. Let's pull back and think about what this kind of deep, long-term separation does, what it means for a people, a place, and even for human nature itself. This isn't just about what's missing. It's about what's possible when a group is left to shape itself in peace, away from the hurricane of outside change. Here's the thing. Most of us have never known true isolation. Even people who feel alone are still connected by roads, laws, and the background noise of the world. But on that secretive island, there's a kind of peace that's almost impossible to find anywhere else. Imagine a life where every face you see is familiar. Your family, your neighbours, maybe a handful of others, no strangers, no one selling things, no one knocking on the door. For some people, that idea sounds comforting. For others, maybe it feels a bit claustrophobic. But for those who've grown up this way, it's just normal. This is the only world they know. All the rhythms of their life, work, rest, celebration, are set by the sun, the weather, and the habits of the land and sea. They shape their days around the tides, the seasons, and the slow cycle of plants and animals. There's a kind of order here that's totally different from the chaos of cities, or the clock-driven rush of modern life. Now, this piece of isolation doesn't mean everything is always calm. There are arguments, accidents, maybe even family feuds. But the problems are the kind that make sense in a small world. No one's worried about rent, job interviews, or social media. Most worries are about food, health, and relationships. It's the kind of stress that comes from being alive, not from the outside pressure to be something you're not. One of the biggest effects of this isolation is stability. Imagine a society where change is slow, where the way you fish, the way you build a shelter, even the way you tell stories has stayed almost the same for generations. There are no new gadgets arriving every year, no new rules from far-off governments, no sudden trend that everyone feels pressured to follow. In some ways, time moves differently. The past isn't just a story, it's a living thing, woven into every part of daily life. Think about how most cultures change. New ideas come in, sometimes by force, sometimes by trade. People pick up new foods, new music, new ways of dressing. In a place that's cut off, none of that happens. The culture doesn't freeze exactly. It grows and shifts, but only from the inside. The people decide together what's worth keeping and what's worth letting go. There's a freedom in that. A freedom to be yourself, in your own way, without being compared to anyone else. Now let's talk about the sense of safety that comes from this kind of peace. In big, busy societies, people lock their doors and worry about crime. On a small island where everyone knows everyone, that kind of fear is different. Sure, there might be arguments or even fights, but the real danger comes from storms, wild animals or sickness, not from strangers. There's a trust that builds over years, even lifetimes. Trust that the group will share food if you're sick. Trust that people will help rebuild after a storm. This isn't just kindness, it's survival. In a tiny world, cooperation isn't just nice, it's necessary. Here's something else to think about. When you live in a place where nothing is written down, memory becomes everything. Stories, rules, and even warnings are passed from one person to another face to face. If someone says, "Don't eat those red berries," you remember. If someone tells a story about the big storm 50 years ago, it becomes part of your own memory, even if you weren't there. This kind of living memory keeps people close to their roots. It stops old mistakes from being forgotten, and it means that every generation is tied directly to the ones before. But isolation also shapes how people see themselves. Without outsiders, there's no one to compare yourself to. No one saying you should be more like them. People measure themselves by the standards of their own group. What matters is what your family thinks, or your elders, or your friends. There's less pressure to impress strangers or fit into a bigger system. This can make life feel more grounded, but it can also mean that change is slow and new ideas have a harder time breaking through. And then there's the question of freedom. It's easy to think of isolated groups as trapped, but in some ways they're more free than anyone else. Free from outside judgment. Free from rules that don't make sense for their way of life. Free to decide what matters most, and to live by those choices. Of course, there are limits. Nature sets hard boundaries. If the island runs out of food, there's nowhere else to go. But within those limits, people have more control over their own fate than most of us ever do. Some experts call this autonomy, the right to make your own decisions as a group. It's a rare thing in today's world. Most places are caught in a web of trade, politics, and outside influence. But in a hidden corner, a group can still decide, together, what kind of life they want to lead. That's a power most societies lost a long time ago. Let's try to picture a day in this kind of peaceful isolation. The sun comes up through the trees. People wake to the sounds of birds and waves. There's no alarm clock, no traffic, no rush. Breakfast is whatever was caught, gathered, or saved from the day before. Maybe it's fish, roots, or fruit, simple foods eaten together. The work is shared out. Some people gather wood, others check traps or collect water. There's time for laughter, for rest, for telling stories. Children play under watchful eyes. Elders teach by showing, not just by talking. The pace is slow but steady. As the day ends, there's time to watch the sky change colours. Maybe there's music, drums, singing, or just the rhythm of hands on wood. Maybe there are stories told by the fire, the same ones heard as children. Or maybe there's silence, broken only by the wind and the sea. It's a life without background noise, without strangers, without the constant buzz of news and worry. Now, this kind of life isn't perfect, far from it. When things go wrong, there's no distant doctor to call. If a storm knocks down homes, everyone has to rebuild. If someone gets hurt, the group comes together, but there are no guarantees. Some problems are solved together, some just have to be endured. But there's a kind of strength that comes from facing trouble as a team. You know who you can count on, because you've counted on them before. In a world that's always telling us to go faster, buy more, and be everywhere at once, the peace of isolation can look almost magical. It's not just about being alone. It's about having space to breathe, to think, to grow in your own direction. For some people, this might sound boring or even scary, but for others, It's a kind of dream, a place where the rules make sense, where every day is shaped by nature, and where you're surrounded by people who know you deeply. Here's another angle. In a group cut off from the rest of humanity, there's room for customs and ideas to develop in strange and beautiful ways. Maybe they've invented games no one else has seen, or ways of solving arguments that are totally unique. Maybe their art, songs or rituals are different from anything the world has ever known. This is creativity, but not the kind that's broadcast to millions of strangers. It's the kind that lives and dies inside a small group, shaped by the land, the seasons, and the slow drift of time. Isolation also means less outside pressure to change. In most societies, people are always being told to keep up or get ahead. On a peaceful island, the main goal is survival and harmony. The best ideas are the ones that work for the group, not the ones that impress outsiders. Over time, this can create a culture that's deeply practical, but also deeply meaningful to the people who live it. But let's not romanticize it too much. There are hard limits set by nature and by the size of the group. If someone feels out of place, there's nowhere else to go. Privacy is rare. Everyone knows everyone's business. There's little space for secrets, and not much chance to try something new without everyone knowing about it. For some, that can feel safe. For others, it might feel like a cage. Still, the peace of isolation offers a kind of security that's hard to find in big, busy places. There are no wars, no invasion, no outside armies. The main threats are storms, hunger, and sickness. Old enemies, but ones people know how to face together. There's no fear of being conquered, taxed, or forced to move. The land is the anchor, the group is the shield. One of the strangest things about isolation is how it shapes the sense of time. In most of the world, history is measured in big events, wars, inventions, leaders. On an island that stayed the same for centuries, time is measured in seasons, in storms, in the slow growth of trees. People remember years by what happened to the land, when the big tree fell, when the sea brought in strange fish, when a new baby was born. This is time as a circle, not a line. And here's a thought. When you don't have written records, the stories you tell become the way you remember. A group's whole history can live in the minds of a few elders. When they're gone, some memories disappear forever. But as long as people keep telling the stories, the past stays alive. In a way, it's a kind of immortality. The dead are never truly gone as long as their stories are told. There's also something special about living in a place where nothing is for sale. No one is buying or selling land, water, or food. Everything is shared, given, or traded face to face. This doesn't mean there's no conflict, but it does mean that the value of things is set by need, not by price. If someone catches extra fish, they share. If someone is sick, the group helps. This kind of sharing is old. It goes back to the roots of being human. And yet, even in this peaceful isolation, people are always watching, always learning from the land. They know the signs of rain, the tracks of animals, the shift in the wind. Their science is local, but it's science just the same. They test, they remember, they teach. Over time, this builds a body of knowledge that's perfectly tuned to their world. Knowledge that would seem strange, even useless to outsiders, but which could mean the difference between life and death on the island. So, what do we learn from this? Maybe that there are many ways to be human. Some ways are loud and busy. Some are quiet and slow. The peace of isolation isn't for everyone, but it's a reminder that not all progress is about moving faster or getting bigger. Sometimes the best life is the one that fits your world, your people, and your dreams. And as you drift toward the edge of sleep, think about this. Somewhere, far away, a fire burns in the darkness. People gather close, sharing warmth and stories, safe in the knowledge that their world is still their own. The waves roll on, the trees stand watch, the peace of their isolation continues, untouched by the noise beyond the horizon. Soon you'll drift as well, moving from your world into the calm of sleep. The last wild places, on islands, in forests, or even just inside our minds, remind us that peace is possible, and that sometimes the best things are the ones we never fully understand. So, after all these twists and turns, what can we really say about people who've lived in near-complete isolation for so long? What happens, not just to their stories, but to their minds, their beliefs, and even their sense of reality? It's tempting to look for a neat answer, but the truth is a lot messier. Let's take a step back and try to put everything in perspective. First, let's think about what isolation actually means for a group. It's not just distance or a line on a map. It's years and years of quietly building your own ways to do things, ways that might look odd or even mysterious to outsiders. Imagine growing up in a place where the only rules that matter are the ones you and your family have always known. There's no outside judge, no one telling you that's not how it's done. Over dozens of generations, this can shape a group in ways we can barely imagine. Here's an interesting angle. Most of us get used to change being constant. We're always expecting the next big thing, new technology, new styles, new foods. But in a world that stays steady, change comes from inside, not outside. People might invent new songs or crafts, but they're building on what's already there. It's a slower, quieter kind of creativity. You don't need to stand out. You just need to belong. Now zoom out and look at the bigger story. History is often told as the march of progress. Cities rising, empires falling, inventions spreading across continents. But there are other stories too. The ones where people just keep doing what works, year after year. That's not failure or backwardness. It's a different kind of success. Survival, balance, peace with the land and with each other. It's easy to forget how rare this is. Almost all groups have been pulled into bigger networks over time, by force, by curiosity, or just by the slow creep of trade and news. To go untouched for so long isn't just luck, it's determination. Sometimes it's hard choices, like refusing gifts or fighting off strangers. Sometimes it's just not being noticed. Sometimes it's a mix of both. And here's a thought that might surprise you. Being cut off from the rest of the world isn't always lonely or sad. For people who've never known anything else, it can feel complete. The group is enough. The land is enough. You know your place. You know what's expected. There's comfort in that kind of certainty. You don't have to wonder if you're missing out because you don't even know what's out there to be missed. But let's not pretend it's all sunshine and harmony. Isolation comes with risks. If something goes wrong, a storm, a sickness, a bad harvest, there's no backup plan, no other village to call for help. Everything depends on the group's own knowledge and stubbornness. That's why the old ways are so important. Every trick, every warning, every story about danger is a tool for survival. Forget them, and you risk everything. Language is one of the most powerful tools a group has. Over hundreds of years it can twist and turn, picking up words that only make sense on that patch of land. Outsiders might hear nothing but strange sounds, but for the people inside, every phrase is packed with history. Words hold secrets, lessons, and jokes that no one else can share. When a language finally disappears, it's not just words that are lost. It's a whole way of thinking. Here's another big piece: belief. In isolation, people can build a view of the world that makes sense for their lives, even if it seems wild to everyone else. Maybe the forest is full of spirits. Maybe the sea has its own moods. Maybe there are deep rules about what can be eaten, who can marry whom, or how to keep the group safe. These aren't just stories, they're blueprints for living. They answer questions, set boundaries, and help people make sense of things they can't control. And then there's the way people see themselves. In a tiny group, you're never just a face in the crowd. You're someone's child, cousin, neighbour, or friend. Reputation matters. Your actions ripple through the whole group. This can make life feel safe. Everyone is connected. Everyone knows where they stand. But it can also make it hard to change or try something new. There's little space for secrets or second chances. Let's talk about memory. In a place without writing, every story, rule, and warning has to be passed down by word of mouth. The oldest people in the group aren't just elders, they're libraries. They remember the time when the big tree fell or when the sea rose and changed the shape of the beach. Their memories are the group's history. When they go, some stories go with them, but every telling, every song, every lesson keeps the past alive. It's a living chain, linking the present to the deep past. Now, what about outsiders? For most of us, meeting someone new is normal. In a closed group, a stranger is something rare, maybe even scary. Every outsider brings questions. Are they safe? Are they a threat? Do they have gifts? Or do they want something? Just a single meeting can change everything. Sometimes the group tightens its walls. Sometimes curiosity wins. People wonder what else is out there. History shows that first contact is almost never simple. Even a small mistake can lead to disaster. But as long as the group stays hidden, they get to decide what matters. They set their own pace. They can make mistakes, fix them, and carry on. There's a kind of freedom in that, one that's almost impossible to find anywhere else today. Here's something that gets overlooked. Science. Not the kind with labs and textbooks, but the kind built from careful watching and testing. People notice which roots are safe to eat, or when the birds start singing before a storm. They learn how to make tools, how to heal wounds, how to read the sky for signs. It's knowledge that's local but deep. It might sound simple, but it's the difference between life and death. Let's not ignore the limits, though. A small group can't invent everything. They're cut off from new tools, new medicines, or wider ideas. If a problem comes up that no one's faced before, there's no outside expert to ask. That's the trade-off, safety and stability in exchange for less variety, less change. Some people would call that a trap. For others, it's peace. Think about how the world has changed in just the last 100 years. Planes, phones, the internet, all of it connects billions of people. News travels in seconds. But in some hidden places, none of that matters. People are still living as they always have, measuring time by sunrise and sunset, by the coming and going of birds, by the growth of trees. It's a reminder that not every place is racing forward. Some are still moving at the old pace. So, what does all this tell us? Maybe the lesson isn't about who's advanced or backward. Maybe it's about finding a way that works for your own world. For some, that means cities and screens and noise. For others, it means quiet and knowing every face and trusting the slow passage of days. There's no single right answer. Human beings can thrive in all sorts of places. Deserts, jungles, frozen forests, islands no one else can find. What matters is the fit between people and place, between dreams and limits. For a group that stayed hidden for thousands of years, their way isn't ours, but it works for them. That's enough. And here's a final thought to take with you as night falls. Every culture, every group, every person is shaped by both what's close and what's far away. Some reach for the horizon, some tend the fire at home. Both choices are part of what makes us human. As you settle in, Imagine the peace that comes from knowing your place in the world. No rush, no strangers. Just the steady heartbeat of your group, your land, your stories. The world outside might be loud and restless, but here, quiet lasts. Time stretches, old songs drift on the wind. May your night be calm, your rest unbroken, and your dreams filled with the gentle silence of distant shores. Sleep well, and let the peace of old worlds carry you through the darkness safe and whole until the sun returns.